The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 876, The Snipe and the Clam Fight. In this naval battle outside the port of Toulon, 4 battleships of the British Mediterranean fleet were sunk, 2 were captured, and 9 others were seriously damaged. As for the French Grand Orient fleet, 9 battleships, including the flagship, were sunk, 11 were seriously damaged, and other auxiliary ships suffered numerous losses. However, in the end, Edward Princeton was forced to abandon his 2 main battleships and escape from the battlefield. Although the British were far ahead in terms of battle loss ratio, the French still had an absolute advantage in numbers with all their main force. The most important thing is that the Gallic roosters that fell into the water did not turn into drowned rats. They still swam hard towards the British ship and tried to board the British ship. What's even more terrible is that the Greeks' inferior coal produced a large amount of waste, causing the boilers to clog. Under full operation, the 2 most advanced paddle wheel warships were scrapped before the battle started. Among the 4 ships that were sunk, there was also a paddle wheel battleship. Its paddle wheel directly lost its ability to move after being hit, and then it became a living target for the French. Edward Princeton knew that there was no need to continue this naval battle. Although he did not want to admit it, the French did win, but they would not be so lucky next time. Although the French Great Eastern Fleet suffered heavy losses, in a sense, the British suffered greater losses, because the capture of 2 advanced paddle wheel warships was very likely to cause the leakage of military secrets. But in Edward Princeton's view, the paddle wheel battleship was a civilian ship that did nothing because the paddle wheel was too huge and extremely fragile. What was even more frightening was that as long as one side was destroyed, it would be completely paralyzed. Because after destroying one side, if only one side rotates, the ship will draw a circle in place. Edward Princeton wrote in his diary, "It will be useful next time if they can get back to Crete." Unfortunately, the British Mediterranean fleet encountered the main force of the Austrian Navy on its way back. This was the first time Edward Princeton saw the Austrian Navy. He looked at those terrifyingly large black iron sitters through his telescope. "What the hell is that, Captain?" "That's the Austrian flag. It's an Austrian ship. They give us 15 minutes to surrender, or they will no longer accept our surrender," the first mate replied with sweat on his face. To be honest, he had never seen such a big ship, and the speed was a bit unscientific. You must know that this is a windless zone. Even the most advanced paddle wheel warships can only make 14 knots, and the Austrians can sail faster than when they have full sail. The first mate joined the ship at the age of 14 and has been at sea for more than 20 years. For the first time, he couldn't believe his eyes. However, Edward Clinton was not aware of this problem. He just ordered, based on his own experience, "Mr. Cole, keep your distance from them. Let's go to Gibraltar." "But, Captain," First Mate Cole wanted to remind Captain Edward, but the latter was still thinking about another more terrifying thing at this time. That is, why did the Austrian Navy appear in the Western Mediterranean? How did the Austrians rush out of the Adriatic Sea, and their fleet, left in Crete, was completely destroyed? The most important thing is, why the Austrians appeared so promptly. Could it be that they colluded with the French? A series of questions sent shivers down Edward Collinson's spine. The war had just begun. Could it be that they had colluded before the war started? This is a conspiracy against the Mediterranean fleet. When did this all start? Edward Princeton did not dare to continue thinking about it. The whole war might have been a conspiracy to exclude the British Mediterranean fleet. He had to tell London the news. The British turned around and ran away, which was completely within Friedrich's expectation. Did you see? This is the invincible British Royal Navy. It will fight when it sees the enemy. It seems that we have no choice but to run away." The Archduke's words immediately caused a burst of booing from the naval officers and soldiers. To be honest, ordinary officers and soldiers did not know the glorious history of the British Royal Navy at all. They only knew that the Austrian Navy had never lost. Friedrich was not arrogant. He had decided to sink British warships with his own hands. since he first saw them showing off in Venice harbor. When he was 10 years old, Friedrich gave up joining the army and instead joined the navy, which was completely ignored in Austria. He personally translated a large amount of British and French naval history, read a large number of books on naval tactics and technology, and lived on a warship almost every day since joining the navy. From the day the British Navy stationed on the large island of Crete, Friedrich was planning to remove this major enemy of Austria in the Mediterranean. In fact, he felt that even without relying on the French, it would not be difficult to destroy the British Mediterranean fleet with the strength of the Austrian navy at this time. But Franz said that this is not the time for us to make a splash, and this will be a brutal war of annihilation. Franz wanted all the British to be buried under the sea. He did not want the strength of the Austrian navy to be completely exposed, and he needed the British and the French to form mortal enemies. Although Friedrich didn't understand why Franz had to do this, he knew that the latter was not a murderous person, and he must have his own reasons for doing so. However, Friedrich felt that, as long as he sank the British warships and left the British sailors to fend for themselves instead of rescuing them. This is the summer in the Mediterranean, and the wind and waves are very small. It may take several weeks for those who fall into the water to float to the shore, and there is basically no chance of survival. About a quarter of an hour later, Edward Princeton discovered a problem. The black iron monsters of the Austrian navy were approaching them. What's going on? Cole. Let's ignore those injured broken ships. Move forward at full speed. Avoid the Austrian fleet. There is no way those large tonnage broken ships can catch up with us. Yes, sir. The flagman on the watchtower signaled full speed ahead, which made the 9 injured warships despair. The British Navy officers and soldiers are all veteran sailors, so how could they not know the semaphore? Commander, Edward has abandoned us. Sooner or later we will be overtaken by the Austrians who are chasing behind us. A veteran cried in frustration. Why don't we escape separately? This way we have a better chance of survival. The Austrians have just issued an ultimatum. If we don't surrender within a quarter of an hour, they will sink us all. Otherwise, we surrender. They will treat the prisoners of war well, right? No. Didn't you read the newspaper? The Austrians are more barbaric than the Arabs. Everywhere they go, men will be killed, as long as they are taller than a wheel. Children will be castrated and used as eunuchs, and all women will be given away. Go to the military prostitute camp. Yes, they all use the Bible as fuel. That's why they went to war with the Papal States. So, we are righteous. Yes, we are the righteous party. Justice will prevail. The warships of both sides finally kept pace with each other. Chapter 877 The Destruction of the British Mediterranean Fleet. Friedrich's latest flagship, the Prinz Eugen super-class battleship, was 1,000 tons heavier than the previous Venetia and almost 4 times the weight of an ordinary sailing battleship. Moreover, all the artillery used are the latest steel large caliber artillery, and the shells are also the latest ship-killing high explosive bombs. The result was that one shelling sent a seriously injured British warship to the bottom of the sea, and most of the other British warships that fell behind also suffered the same fate. In fact, it is not that the British did not fight back, but there is a huge gap between the old sail warships and the new ironclad ships. The former's counterattack was very weak, and could only barely knock off the anti-corrosion paint on the side strings of the latter. The bait Edward Collinson threw at Frederick was infuriated by the fact that it had no delaying effect. Damn it. What is that thing? How can it be so fast? Faster than a paddle wheel battleship, Captain. That must be a steam battleship too. Look, it has a chimney on it. Idiot. Are you a pig? How can a steam battleship not have a paddle wheel? Being reprimanded by his superior, First Officer Cole was also speechless, but the black smoke must have come from the steam engine, and he didn't know why there was no paddle wheel. I don't know, sir. But those guys are at least twice as fast as us, and we will definitely be doomed if this continues. Edward Princeton was so angry that he almost chewed the pipe in his mouth. He was determined to meet the Austrian Navy personally. He didn't believe it was real steel, because iron was denser than wood, so an iron ship couldn't be faster than a wooden ship. This is common sense. The Austrian Navy's ships must be so fast, because the wood is painted black. Order the entire fleet to form and attack. Edward Collinston gave the order decisively, and the orderly soldiers immediately waved flags to say that the British Navy at this time is worthy of the title of the world's best navy. It can temporarily change formations even when escaping. However, the Austrian naval fleet chose to stagger away from them, just as the British fleet was confused. Edward Collinston discovered the astonishing fact that the Austrians had seized the T-head. The Austrian navy built by Friedrich himself was equally good or even better, and had more advanced equipment. There was no suspense in the entire naval battle. The Austrian navy completely annihilated the remaining British Mediterranean fleet without losing a single warship. Earlier, Friedrich also annihilated the British squadron that was preparing to blockade the Adriatic Sea. The commander of the squadron even wanted to deal with the Austrian navy at an absolute disadvantage, but naturally he was buried at the bottom of the sea with the glory of fighting the enemy when he saw it. The British army entrenched. Indurus was attacked by the Austrian army. Commodore Wesley could only escape to Crete with the remaining troops. After landing, he was attacked by the Austrian Marine Corps. Commodore Wesley was killed in the battle, and Commodore Bronson, who took over the command, surrendered to the Austrians and all 10 battleships were captured. At this point, the British Mediterranean fleet was completely destroyed, but the newspaper headlines showed that only Marshal Bucquet-Reynaud, commander-in-chief of the French Grand Eastern Fleet, had won a decisive victory in the Western Mediterranean at the cost of his own flagship and 8 other battleships, successfully breaking the British blockade and the myth of invincibility. In fact, the reason why the Austrian navy did not support Venice before was because the main force of the navy was not in Trieste at all. The British had always blocked a non-existent navy. Friedrich's main force had secretly headed to Tripoli and secret ports in Greece in batches before the war began. 15,000 Marine Corps officers and soldiers have stayed on the island of Crete for nearly a month. Everything is waiting for the closing of the net today. Including the 2 British paddle wheel warships that accidentally broke down. It was actually Franz's credit. As for joining forces with the French, that was out of the question. After all, it was impossible for Austria to recognize the French Republican government, let alone cooperate with it. But the Count of Chambord was different. Cooperating with the Bourbon family to resist the British was completely in the interests of both countries. Although Count de Beauvoir was not the King of France at this time, he did not want the British to plunder French colonies for Greece, let alone the cousin relationship between France and Otto I. The temptation of the large island of Crete alone made the entire Greek government unable to control itself. As for the French provisional government, they are eager for someone to help them solve their immediate urgent needs. The French provisional government, Louis Philippe of the Orleans dynasty, and Henry V, Count of Chambord, of the Bourbon dynasty, simultaneously awarded him the highest naval honor. The Austrian naval force breaking the blockade and raiding the large island of Crete occupies only a minimal space. The news reached London. Since it was April Fool's Day, no one believed the news and regarded it as a crude joke. After all, the British Royal Navy has never failed to deal with the French. As for Austria, it is a country with only inland patrols. They rely on the recruitment of armed merchant ships from Venice to fight wars. The British Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Auckland, even claimed, if the Austrians and the French can defeat their own navies, then they will go to the bullpen and eat shit for a day. In fact, it was not just him. John Russell, Palmerston, Viscount Stratford, Home Secretary George Grey, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Wood, and even Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. No one believed this unreliable news. They just thought the French and Austrians were too humorous. Vienna announced the news of the naval victory, but again no one believed it. In fact, a bigger storm was brewing in Vienna at this time. The 2 temporary members of the Regency Council, Earl Raikkonen and Baron Kiel, did a stupid thing. They first disclosed the contents of 12 treaties with the Hungarians, and then chose to negotiate peace with them. This greatly aroused dissatisfaction among nationalists. People were disappointed with the government and eagerly awaited the emergence of a strongman. Then pro-British factions and liberals united to cause trouble. They used rebellions in Bohemia and Hungary, as well as external British and Italian coalition forces, to put pressure on the government. Solomon Rothschild transformed himself into a liberal leader, throwing aside the Medal of Honor he had received from his previous government. No constitution, no money. No constitution, no money. Solomon's move immediately triggered a chain reaction. Almost all bankers in Vienna said that if the Austrian government could not promulgate a constitution that conformed to their wishes, then the Austrian government would not be able to borrow another penny. The privileged nobles who had not been cleaned up before also took this opportunity to cause trouble. They opened the armory of the Vienna City Defense Army and deliberately distributed weapons to civilians. These people are not afraid because they are armed, but those without guns are in dire straits. A large number of barricades began to appear in the city of Vienna. The violence continued to escalate, and the city once again entered a state of anarchy. Chapter 878 Hungary. In fact, theoretically speaking, the Hungarian Great Plains, a land rich in water and grass, should not have a food crisis. However, 3 consecutive years of natural disasters starting in 1845 and their accompanying food harvests made the situation in Hungary unprecedentedly worse. Coupled with the economic crisis that broke out in the United Kingdom, Hungary's industry and agriculture plunged into the Great Depression. Whether they are conservative aristocrats or liberal capitalists, their first thought is to pass the crisis on to the common people. Amid this food crisis and economic crisis, Hungary's food prices have reached an unprecedented height, while the purchase price of food has hit a record low point. Under this strange operation, a large number of farmers went bankrupt. In theory, bankrupt farmers are conducive to the development of industry. But the reality is that the economic crisis and Hungary's own high tariff barriers have resulted in their goods being unable to be sold at all. Domestic civilians have no spending power, so their goods are very unsellable. So they naturally don't need the extra labor. A woodcutter could only earn one meal for 3 days' work, and the situation was similar in a factory. Desperate farmers and workers launched some riots, but they did not have unified command, let alone mutual coordination. Therefore, small-scale riots were quickly suppressed, and large-scale riots were quickly aborted due to lack of organization. Compared with the tragic experience of the Hungarians, the royal estate is a prosperous scene. This is not to say that disasters have not visited here. Whether it is floods or droughts, the royal estate also has to face it, but at this time the importance of leadership is reflected. Under the unified coordination of the royal stewards and appointed officials, the ability of the royal estate to resist natural risks has been greatly enhanced. Dams were built in the face of floods, and aqueducts were built in the face of drought. Coupled with the financial and technical support given by France, it was naturally a new and prosperous scene. At the same time, the quality of German immigrants was generally higher than that of serfs in Hungary, and they were more capable of accepting and transforming natural things. Moreover, most of them had lost their original social relationships, making it easier to manage. In summary, the difference between Hungarian villages and royal estates is very obvious. However, since there were also a large number of Hungarian refugees that Franz had sneaked into the royal estate, he did not have to worry about no one promoting him. In fact, those Hungarians who were almost sold to North America now only had admiration and gratitude for Franz and the Habsburg royal family. The life in the royal manor was unimaginable to them in the past. Having ample food, clothing, and living and working in peace and contentment was a life that even the lower class Hungarian nobles could not enjoy. Of course, some ultra-nationalists with ulterior motives will not miss this opportunity to discredit Austria. They take advantage of people's jealousy and claim that the Austrians have taken away the pastoral that should belong to them. This kind of smearing and rumors was quite effective, and soon a large number of people began to hate Austria and the Habsburg family, but most people just wanted to join the royal estate. On the other hand, the Hungarians living in the royal estates are desperately defending Austria and the royal family. After all, they are a vested interest group in a sense. Whether out of justice or for their own interests, they have to defend the Austrian side. As a result, this contradiction easily tore the crowd apart, and the Hungarians quickly divided into 2 groups and began to distinguish themselves from each other, while at the same time intensifying the contradiction. The anti-Austrians believed that the Austrians had taken away their land, their good life, and Hungary's luck in development. Just drive the Austrians out of Hungary and you'll have a good life. The pro-Austrian faction is tit for tat. They feel that the Hungarian nobles do not care about the life and death of the lower class, and the royal estate should be the final destination of the Hungarians. As long as the entire Hungary is turned into a royal territory, the contradictions will naturally disappear and everyone can live a happy life. The high-ranking Count Zecheny is still making his final efforts. He hopes to prevent this war, and wants to use his unrealistic plans to resolve the conflicts between the two sides, because from a capitalist's perspective, the behemoth Austria is simply unshakable, and Hungary's poor industrial output is a joke from the former's perspective. The most terrible thing is that Austria itself has a huge market and sources of raw materials, while the Hungarian industry relies on smuggling and blood transfusions from the nobles to support itself. The potentials of the two sides are simply not the same. Prince Elthasy and some traditional nobles have begun to hoard food, train soldiers, move away from big cities, and start living in isolation to build their own manors into strong fortresses. These people have a very keen sense of smell and are very experienced. They know that the time has come to reshuffle the cards. This is their opportunity to at least keep their family's industry. Of course, there are some idiots who are adding fuel to the fire, and some people who want to turn a blind eye to the facts, but they are not necessarily being perverse. In short, their deliberate efforts to whitewash peace aroused the resentment of the public and student groups, and angered some of the people who least deserve to be offended. With the outbreak of the Sicilian uprising, Hungary entered a period of turmoil, with all kinds of demons and monsters competing to perform. However, most things cannot surprise Franz. Only Pitofi may have been accidentally hit by accident, or maybe he was the son of a farmer. This talented poet proposed to unite the serfs, not only to give them freedom, but also to give them land and rights, and then unite to fight against Austria. But this genius idea was quickly rejected by the leader Kossuth, because the concept at that time generally believed that serfs represented ignorance, stupidity, laziness, and greed. Not to mention serfs, as long as they have anything to do with the countryside, they will be looked down upon by others, including country people, country nobles, and country businessmen. On the one hand, it was embarrassing for Kossuth to unite with the serfs or peasants. On the other hand, liberating the serfs was indeed their slogan, but letting the peasants get land and rights was another matter. In fact, the Hungarians' purpose in liberating serfs was to provide more labor for manual workshops, and at the same time, hiring agricultural workers was cheaper than serfs. They did not intend to do any charity. Dividing the land would cost the lives of those nobles. Naturally, Kossuth did not dare to do so, and his supporters would not allow him to do so. Therefore, Pitofi's plan was aborted, but Pitofi hated the nobility very much, because his experience in Vienna made him feel that the aristocrats were the worms of the country. Rather than joining forces, Pitofi felt disgusted, but Kossuth was the leader, and he knew very well that those nobles had money, guns, and soldiers, and they were the main force against Austria. But it was a good thing that he didn't continue, because the killer sent by Franz to Hungary was already ready to take action. In fact, the vast majority of Hungarian landowners at this time fit the stereotype in people's minds, being selfish, misbehaving, lazy as pigs, and horribly stupid. Chapter 879 Pervax Cafe. Many of them have not realized the seriousness of the problem. They still imagine that their lives can go on forever, and they do not care at all about the problems in Austria or Hungary. Some people in the entire country are preparing for war, some people are watching indifferently, and the remaining people have no idea what is happening, and are approaching madness in such a strange state. However, the Hungarians have also made achievements over the years. They built a railway with a total length of 30 kilometers. However, due to insufficient pig iron production, some was imported from Austria, and a complete set of equipment such as locomotives was also purchased. The Hungarians don't want to use Austrian equipment, but they can't produce it. Other countries either can't ship it, or the price is sky high, and the performance is still very poor, so they could only use Austrian goods. But this behavior was resisted by Hungarian nationalists, who even claimed to dismantle the railway. Pitofi had a different view. After all, he had been to Vienna and knew the power of railways and machinery, so he strongly praised this behavior. The speed of the train is amazing. You should all try it. I really want our motherland to also be on the train, so that it may be able to make up for the gap of hundreds of years. However, Petofi's poems are still very sharp. He looks down on the aristocrats and landlords who are stuck in their ways, and he also looks down on the short-sighted capitalists. We are running non-stop. Are you tired? Not at all. The train carries us forward bravely. Take us into a new world. Build the railway. Build the railway. Repair 1,000 lines. Repair 10,000 lines. Let them spread throughout the world, just like those blood vessels. Why not build railways? Lack of rails. That's enough to smash the slaves' shackles. To be honest, Franz admired and appreciated Petofi's biting sarcasm. It's just that the former is determined to rebel, and the conflicts between the two parties cannot be reconciled. Franz cannot betray his class and family, so the winner must be determined. February 22nd, 1848, Hungary. In a cafe called Pierbach's in Pest, you can see all kinds of people in strange clothes. Some of them were dressed like hussars, some were wearing medieval dress and wigs, and some were trying to look like Huns. Someone is holding a wine glass, someone is holding an axe. Someone is holding a hammer, someone is holding a bone cutter. From time to time, there were shouts and curses, and the sound of axes and knives chopping wood was often heard. Of course, there were also cheers of toasting. Hanging on the wall is a portrait of Marat, the friend of the people. Of course, this time he is not in a bathtub, but fully clothed, and holding a constitution symbolizing freedom. When the news about France and Bohemia reached the small cafe, everyone was excited. Stand up and act. Our friends, the radical leader Wasi Wali shouted, and he chopped his axe on the table with a dull crisp sound. We must not miss the opportunity to make Europe great again like our fathers did. The French and the Bohemians have made a start for us. Now it's time for Attila's descendants to show up. Bushivali, you are right. We should teach those big shots what to do. We can't let them think that plugging their ears with cotton will make everything fine. Yes. We must take action, Mr. Petofi. Come with us, Mr. Petofi. Mr. Petofi. Petofi was young, but very talented, and he was one of the first people to follow Kossuth, so everyone was convinced of him. Petofi stood up, and the crowd cheered. Pace University students and young radicals rushed into the street and shouted, "Revolution! We want revolution! Overthrow the puppet government of the Austrians, and overthrow the rule of the Habsburg dynasty." The young people shouted loudly, but because the Pierbach's cafe was in the downtown area and today was a market day, so their loud shouts were quickly drowned out by the shouts of hawkers, and the young people were a little at a loss. The French and Czechs have already taken action. We are descendants of the great Attila. We are the whip of God. Are you all deaf? The numb crowd still ignored these young lunatics. Petofi felt a little heartbroken, but he knew that heartache alone was not enough. Petofi asked for a ladder and climbed directly to the warning bell tower. This warning bell was prepared to prevent the Ottoman invasion and had a history of hundreds of years. Petofi grabbed the rusty pendulum and pulled it hard. The ancient copper bell rang again with a distant and long sound. The sonorous sound of sounded, and the noisy market became quiet for a moment. Everyone looked at the young man standing on the tower. Petofi let go of the pendulum. At this time, the ancient clock fell off due to the wear and tear of the years. With the final dung sound, Petofi asked loudly, 5 out of 10 babies in Hungary die before their first birthday. We work an average of 20 hours just to have a piece of bread. There is no salt in our soup, no meat, no milk for the kid. Do we still have to endure it? Everyone knew what Petofi was going to say, but some people closed the windows because they didn't want to hear it out of fear or for other reasons. Yes, close the windows so you can't see the outside world. The crowd began to murmur, and Petofi continued, I tell you, the French, the Italians, the Czechs, the Poles, they have all taken action. The streets of Vienna are full of barricades. Austria is finished. There is a turmoil everywhere. And we are wavering, as descendants of the Huns. Don't you feel ashamed? Where is your blood? Exclamation mark. Here, at this time, the young students and radicals had their effect and immediately responded in unison. What are you waiting for? Take action. Let's move. Let's move. The mood of the crowd also rose. What should we do? Some People couldn't help but asked in confusion. They didn't know how people in other countries did it. People were a little confused. Are they going to attack the city hall? Or beat up 2 policemen or officials at random? We are descendants of the Huns. We either don't do it, or we do something big. Let's go to the parliament. We need to ask Mr. Kossuth to take charge. We want to break our shackles. Under Potoffi's call, people rushed to tell each other, and the crowd soon gathered into an unstoppable torrent. Point in the Grand Council in Pest, Kossuth is fighting with the crowd. He will convince every member present before the crowd outside rushes in. Point it was finally Kossuth's turn to speak on stage, but news came that Potoffi had gathered people outside and was rushing to the parliament. Point one conservative lawmaker asked with great disdain, "Dear Mr. Kossuth, are you trying to force us to submit?" Chapter 880 National Song. Kossuth had long been accustomed to the bluffing tactics of these nobles. In fact, the more he came into contact with them, the more pitiful he felt about these people. Point they can only live in their own circle, use some standardized words, and live within a certain range. Point it's really ridiculous. How can a person without freedom be called a noble? I don't mean to force you. If you don't want to listen, you can leave, and leave a place for those who want to listen. Naturally, the conservative congressman did not have the courage to go out, but his status as a nobleman prevented him from letting go of his arrogance. Although he was panicking inside, he still had to pretend to be angry. Kossuth smiled slightly mockingly, and began his speech. 300 years have passed since the Austrians stole the crown of St. Stephen. For us Hungarians, this is a hell of constant pain. God has blessed this country with all the element of wealth and happiness, with an area of 284,898.69 square kilometers and a population of 15 million. It was strategically located at the center of Europe. Its resources were rich, and its land was fertile enough to feed the entire Austrian Empire. It can be said that without us, Austria would not be what it is today. It was we who blocked the Arabs. Without us, Western civilization would have ceased to exist. The audience immediately burst into warm applause. All this was under Kossuth's control. He pressed his hands and continued, "But the sacrifices of our great nation and great country did not earn us gratitude, but only gave us a pair of shackles. It was our support in the war for the Austrian throne that allowed the Lorraine Habsburg family to secure the throne. But after they made peace, the first thing they did was to suppress us. This is naked betrayal. In fact, there has never been a family in the world as lucky as the Habsburgs. They can enjoy the benefits, as long as they don't hinder the development of this country. But the Austrians are afraid. They are afraid, and dare not give us a constitution and moderate liberties. They are jealous of the freedom of the Hungarians, jealous of the power of the Hungarians, and they want to bind us forever, just like all the other peoples who were deprived of their freedom. They locked us in the tank of slavery. They want to kill our creativity, kill our freedom, take away the power given to us by God, in order for us to benefit Austria, in order to let their fool emperor spend extravagance." Mr. Kossuth is right. It is said that Ferdinand I only ate the brains of animals, which were as big as a whole cow. He ate the brains of the cow, and fed the rest to his hunting dogs. A cow for one meal is such a waste. A Hungarian parliamentarian said, while gesturing as if he saw it with his own eyes. A group of people who didn't know what was going on were immediately filled with indignation. They really couldn't imagine that someone could be so wasteful at this time, when they were not picking up porn. But some opponents scoffed. "Have you been to Vienna? The emperor invited you to visit. Do you know how much a cow's brain weighs? You wouldn't be able to bear the brains of 3 cows a day. Isn't His Majesty the Emperor unable to move? Can he still have dogs?" Kossuth was helpless because of the poor ability of his subordinates to praise him. After all, most of these people were from humble backgrounds, and those genuine college students could not do such dirty deeds, so he could only pretend not to hear and continue speaking. "I am not a fan of rebellion, but I feel that when a country is forced to ally itself with its enemies for a long time, it is natural that we should expel the evil ruler. In addition to this, the Austrians were guilty of many crimes, hiring foreign armies to murder their own people. Although Hungary ostensibly had an independent government, they were merely puppets of the Vienna cabinet. They are the means by which the Austrians rule us. They use the blood and money of our people to please their Austrian masters. putting our interests behind palace intrigues, and we are nothing more than an Austrian colony. The Italians have succeeded in Sicily, and the French and Czechs will raise the flag of righteousness against their masters. What are we waiting for? Exclamation mark. The speech is a bit rough, but the original version is rougher. The Kossuth faction in the Pest parliament was naturally excited, but the conservative and liberal bosses were a little worried. Because this is different from what they had agreed before. What they want is the opportunity to negotiate with the Austrian government, rather than actually going to war with the Austrians at this time. They all turned their attention to Bojany Lajos, who was both a Hungarian noble and a commissioner sent by Austria. The new governor, Bojany Lajos, stood up and began to take the lead in applauding, and the others could only stand up and applaud. The big nobles and big capitalists were very depressed. They never expected that such a speech would actually impress the Hungarian governor, but what they didn't know was that Bojany Lajos had exchanged many letters with Kossuth when he was in Vienna, so the latter would act like this on this occasion. In fact, if there was no such relationship, Bojany Lajos would have detained Kossuth without any reason, or killed him directly, and those Hungarian nationalists would have been unable to do anything. But without this relationship, Kossuth would not be so stupid as to fall into the tiger's mouth. Outside the Pest Congress, Potoffi hardly said a word along the way, just lowering his head and thinking about something. Many people were afraid of their leader, but in fact, Potoffi completed the greatest work of his life, Song of the Nation. Along the way, I will publish a separate free chapter about the national song for everyone to read, so I will leave it here to count the words. Swear to the God of Hungary, we swear an oath, we swear, we no more slavery. Potoffi's impromptu poem infected the marching crowd, and people began to sing the catchy lyrics. Thousands of voices recited with him, and the crowd gathered more and more, but the noisy voices disappeared, and were replaced by reciting in unison. The spectacular sight and momentum of tens of thousands of people singing in unison cannot be compared to the concerts of later generations of singers, but the same is the same crazy crowd. The marching crowd sang the Song of the Nation over and over again, while tearing down the fence and storming the Parliament Hall. The overwhelming momentum frightened the war horses so much that they raised their hooves high, and the military police could only keep retreating under the impact of the people. At this time, Kossuth inside the court took good advantage of the commotion outside. He shouted loudly to those members who were still hesitant, "Here, this is the cry of Hungary. Either obey it or be swallowed up by it. Decide for yourself." The overwhelming voice outside cannot be deceived. Those nobles naturally know that power is stronger than others. A quarter of an hour later, Kossuth appeared in front of the Grand Council of Pest. The crowd immediately burst into loud cheers, knowing they had won. Chapter 881. Mr. Kossuth. Mr. Kossuth, Potoffi excitedly stepped forward to hug his idol. "You are so awesome. You actually convinced them." Kossuth was also very happy and patted Potoffi on the shoulder. "You are amazing, my friend. Look, this is what we Hungarians are. Enthusiasm and energy that makes God jealous. No one can oppress us. We are born free." Potoffi shouted, "Long live freedom." The crowd also chanted, "Long live freedom. Long live Hungary. Long live Hungary." Night. After 3 drinks, Potoffi said, "Mr. Kossuth, I think going to war is not a wise choice. We should give the Austrians a chance for peace." Kossuth was a little surprised. "My friend, why do you say this? This is not like you. You are the pride of our nation. The great Potoffi, the son of the nation." "Mr. Kossuth, believe me, I hate Austria more than anyone else, but you have never been to Vienna. The city walls of Vienna are higher than the spires of our churches. Just one district is as big as Pest, and Vienna has more than 20 districts." Kossuth was unmoved. "My friend, what does this mean? But that the Austrians are extravagant. If the city walls were really useful, then Constantinople and Rome would not have fallen." "Mr. Kossuth, do you know how much it costs to maintain such a huge city? Austria's national power is far superior to ours, and its military strength is 5 times ours. And I don't want to be the scourge of God and destroy a city like this." Hearing what Potoffi said, Kossuth finally let out a sigh of relief. "Don't worry, my friend. If the Austrians can accept our conditions, then I don't want to fight with each other, let alone destroy those historical relics. But if they want to continue to rule us with tyranny, then I, Kossuth, will be the first to refuse. Kossuth's words immediately won the applause of the whole house, but Petofi was a little confused. What? Conditions? This time it was Kossuth's turn to be confused. My friend, didn't you draft those 12 articles of peace? Oh my god. Mr. Kossuth, it is impossible for the Austrians to agree. Petofi's drunkenness immediately sobered up for the most part. Those 12 articles were indeed drafted by him, but they were all fantasies of all parties. Everyone said something to each other, but Petofi himself was in the mood and didn't care so much. But when you calm down for a moment, you will realize that that is simply impossible. Austria is a great power, and what a great power is that it represents absolute strength. Austria was also besieged during the 30 Years' War and the war for the Austrian throne, but it still stands today, while the once mighty kingdom of Hungary has been destroyed several times. But Kossuth didn't care about this. He only knew that the whole of Hungary was unprecedentedly unified at this time. Petofi's 12 points are so wonderful that they unite those who were originally opposed to or disapproving of Kossuth. Friends, you must know that Austria's previous policy towards us was to divide and rule. Now with your 12 points, we are finally united. Kossuth's words ignited Petofi's hope again. Because if the 12 points can be realized, then Hungary can indeed be freed from the shackles of Austria forever. Then people will definitely live happily, right? As an idealist, Petofi naturally would not refuse this bold proposal. After a brief weighing of the pros and cons, he decided to still support Kossuth. Mr. Kossuth, you are right. As long as our great motherland can be independent, I have nothing to fear. We are proud Hungarians. We are the eagles of freedom. Let us spread our wings and fly high. This is my good brother. Cheers. Erupted once again in the Pier Wax Cafe. In fact, the reason why Kossuth is so confident is not just Petofi and Borjani, as well as those supporters in Parliament. Not long ago, in addition to Pius IX and Palack's people, there was also a more important figure who came to him, that is, the British envoy, who brought Kossuth even more exciting news. The British would support Pius IX in the war between Austria and the Papal States. And they would also support all free actions and freedom-loving people. The British envoy even promised Kossuth that he would support him as president if the Kingdom of Hungary became independent. In addition, the UK will sign an equal trade agreement with the Kingdom of Hungary, which will benefit both parties. What the British refer to as equal trade is actually what they call free trade. The British's industrial strength completely overwhelmed Hungary, and lower tariffs were actually more disadvantageous to them. However, Kossuth did not understand this. He only knew that the Austrians developed through foreign trade and colonial plunder. The British are obviously much more high-end than Austria's trading partners. Kossuth feels that he can definitely use the British to develop himself and replace them. Kossuth did not expect that the British Mediterranean fleet would be annihilated in 2 weeks. He felt that he should prove his value as an ally. On February 23, 1848, the 12-point peace agreement drafted by Petofi and approved by the PES Grand Council was sent to Vienna. At the same time, Kossuth found Baojani, who needed to do something earth-shattering, attack on Pressburg. Baojani was almost shocked. He didn't expect Kossuth to have such a crazy idea. You must know that Pressburg is less than 50 kilometers away from Vienna, the capital of Austria, and it is an extremely strong fortress. The Austrian Empire spent countless manpower and material resources here for hundreds of years, just to ensure the peace and tranquility of this place. The most important thing is that this move is not just a threat, it is a direct declaration of war. Yes. I feel that we must prove to the Austrians the superiority of our Hungarian nation. Only the fortified city of Pressburg, a city that was impossible to fall in the eyes of the Austrians, was worthy of this operation. Baojani swallowed and explained quickly, Mr. Kossuth, with all due respect, it is impossible to capture Pressburg with our current armaments. I once served as an intern at Pressburg. It was a fortress that was carefully polished. Even if it was besieged by 100,000 troops, they could sustain it for at least half a year, and I have reliable information that at the beginning of the year Pressburg was sent 5 additional regiments for unknown reasons. Their total strength now is 15,000. If we want to capture this strong fortress, we will need at least 10 times that strength. Kossuth shook his head after hearing this. If you don't have 150,000 people, I can dispatch at most 8,000 to 10,000 regular troops and 3,000 local armed forces to you. Mr. Kossuth, this is simply sending yourself to death. No, Mr. Borgini, I think you are definitely qualified for this job. If there is anyone in the world who can help Hungary win this war, that person must be you. Kossuth said it very sincerely, which made Borgini feel very honored. Sometimes the power of idols is so terrible that it can make people make decisions that are completely contrary to reason. Chapter 882 Going Home Absurdly. Venice, City Hall. The Hungarians added insult to injury as Franz had expected, but to prevent the Pressburg massacre from happening, he deliberately added 5 complete infantry regiments to Pressburg in the name of the War Department, totaling 8,000 men, so that Pressburg's total strength reached 15,000 men. In fact, had it not been for the historical tragedy, Pressburg would have been the kind of fortified city that would have been impossible to fall. As Vienna's last barrier in the east, its importance is self-evident. The city was captured only 3 times over the centuries, by Suleiman the Magnificent, Napoleon, and Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa. The city is high and deep, with complete firepower and sufficient food and grass. It is located at the confluence of the Morava River and the Danube River, surrounded by water on 3 sides. Only one side needs to engage the enemy, which greatly limits the attacker's strength advantage. No matter from any point of view, it is worthy of being indestructible. Franz couldn't imagine how such a fortress could not hold out for even a day. However, in view of the fact that Austria has had too many weird deeds in history, such as letting all the officers die before the war started, which led to the collapse of their own entire command system. Or maybe you use half of the opponent's troops to fight an annihilation battle, but are annihilated by the opponent instead. After deciphering the enemy's code, you proactively contact the opponent to ask if they will change the password, etc. Franz decided to make a temporary change, but naturally it couldn't be in a conflict-provoking way such as transfer or promotion. Franz decided to let the general in charge of Pressburg go on vacation. Although the treatment of Austrian soldiers in history was a mess, the benefits of the officers were not many. In addition to 1 day of holiday per week, there are 7 days of monthly leave each month and 28 days of annual leave each year. All 3 are calculated separately. In summary, Austrian officers have an average of 164 days of vacation per year, but this still makes the nobles complain a lot. In fact, military positions in Austria are more like honorary titles. Officer salaries are very low, and cavalry officers even have to buy their own horses. This is also one of the important reasons why the Hungarians are so unruly, because many of the ranks of cavalry officers are bought, and they purchase their own horses, and are responsible for their own training. This is a bit like the regiment training in the late Qing dynasty. Too much autonomy and too low profitability led to the long-term problems of low morale and bad military discipline in the cavalry units. The Austrian Empire's long-standing shortcomings for hundreds of years were not something that Franz could explain in a sentence or 2, let alone a simple move of his fingers. The roots of corruption have long been rooted deep in the earth, and the intertwined interests are like a mess. Franz tried to build a new type of army himself, but if he just had a playful mentality, then nobles and businessmen will send high quality horses, exquisite sabers, gorgeous hussar uniforms, as well as suitable training venues and trainers. Rich clan families will even send in their best disciples, but once Franz goes beyond the level of play, he will encounter all kinds of unexpected troubles. It may happen that the horses are collectively frightened and disappear, and the horseshoes are not nailed properly, causing them to fall off the horse and die. Therefore, the size of the regular troops that Franz could control never exceeded 10,000. Because those people may feel that this is a safe number, however, Franz was not completely devoid of counterattacks. These people wanted to put their hands into his arsenal. Franz simply broke them and deliberately threw the stumps on the street. In the past, counter-infiltration was not so difficult when a Jenny was around. Colonel Bordeaux worked very hard, and Ajana's successors were also dedicated to their duties, but Franz still had to warn others, by killing the chicken, to scare the monkeys. The military industry and the Academy of Sciences were Franz's bottom line. They could run the military industry, but no one could touch Franz's arsenal. Similarly, Franz does not mind those privileged classes investing in education or technology, but they must compete based on their ability, rather than come to Franz to poach people, or directly replace technological progress with power control. In fact, the arrival of the Year of the Storm also gave Franz the opportunity to liquidate himself. Most of the people who restricted Franz were also causing trouble in Vienna at this time. The logic of this group of people is very simple, which is to resolutely limit the imperial power and never allow the royal family to dominate. In fact, this is a tragedy of the times. They cannot wake up from the struggle between the nobility and the royal power. It's not that they can't see new opponents, but they are unwilling to abandon their old concepts, even if they drag the entire class with them. But Franz will not let them get what they want. Since they like to make trouble, Franz will help them make it bigger. Franz learned that the privileged nobles and businessmen had gone to the liberal side again, and he decided not to return to Vienna. The reason? Of course, the railway is not smooth. In fact, some people had sent people to blow up the railway in order to prevent Franz from returning to Vienna, but the people they sent happened to be the spies sent by Franz. Franz's base is indeed the aristocracy, but the privileged class is not equal to the entire aristocracy. Franz wants to deal with them, not to commit suicide, nor to betray his own class. On the contrary, what Franz did was to save the aristocracy and eliminate the blood. It is ridiculous to equate the privileged class with the entire aristocratic class. There is no reason why the benefits should only be enjoyed by everyone, while everyone should share the blame. After so many years of careful transformation by Franz, Vienna has nurtured so many groups. If it still can't resist the pressure, then he doesn't mind a thorough cleaning. Of course, Franz will take his family out before then. After all, at that time, the inheritance of the royal family will be more important than anything else. Otherwise, it will be like the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. It can no longer be described as falling apart. It can only be said to be in pieces. Franz would not be idle until he returned to Vienna. Fortunately, the old emperor wanted to make Venice the capital of the Austrian Empire. Later, Franz also managed it while developing overseas trade and colonies. Therefore, Venice at this time is fully capable of being a companion capital, with both the bureaucratic system and the economic system in place. As for the so-called rebels and insurgents, they either threw the Italian tricolor flag in the ditch, or rushed into the Jesuit church and bought it for $0. Perhaps the transformation of these Italian nationalists was a bit sudden, but it makes sense when viewed from another perspective. Most of the rebels just regarded the revolution as a business. Neither the Carbonari nor Pius IX had the influence they imagined. In fact, the reason why those people revolted before was because they felt that the Italian nationalists could win, and they could gain benefits by following them. Just as nationalists were betrayed and attacked at this time, and churches were sacked, it was also because doing so was in the best interest of those who were insurrection. In other words, they will help whoever wins. This is a typical characteristic of small citizens. They like to think in a bourgeois way, but they have no capital, so they can only be the pawns they despise most. This is also the reason why uprisings in northern Italy mostly occur in cities. Compared with citizens, farmers are more risk averse, so as long as they are not able to survive, they will not rebel easily. Of course, Franz knew this very well, so he only needed to give out some relief grains and then raise the purchase price of the grains. Those farmers will stay at home honestly. When the urban insurgents go to the countryside to recruit soldiers, they will encounter desertions or even resistance. In the eyes of farmers, the government that distributes relief grains to them and collects crops at high prices is a good person, while the government that makes them unable to eat is the bad guy. Driven by these simple values, Austria's eyes are almost everywhere in northern Italy. As for those outsiders who hunted down and killed the rebels everywhere, Franz was not prepared to condone them either. It is true that using them can better suppress Italian nationalists, but this is not conducive to the restoration of order. What Franz wants now is to restore order. Whether it is stabilizing the Venetian region or supporting Albrecht's Po River defense line, a good order is needed. The best way to quickly stabilize order is to use severe punishment, which can be translated into easy to understand words with one word: kill. In fact, Franz killed many more people to stabilize order than when he pacified Venice. However, in order to prevent abuse of power, Franz delegated the power to impose the death penalty only to lieutenants. At the same time, the death penalty must be reported and recorded. There were many college students among the rebels in Venice, and Franz directly recruited these prisoners of war to help record the war. There are 3 reasons for this. First of all, Franz does not have that many men. Secondly, college students are still very precious in this era, and he is a little reluctant to part with them. In the end, Franz was just a human being. He had compassion and felt that these young people might have been led astray. However, the crimes they committed must also be repaid, and these young people will be sent to the battlefield after completing the work assigned to them by Franz. If they can survive, then they still have a chance to atone for their sins slowly. Otherwise, let them wash away their sins with blood. Po River line of defense. Albrecht's march was very fast, and the insurgents and rebels he encountered along the way could not pose a threat to his army at all. The construction of the defense line has been basically completed, and the equipment from the rear and the reinforcement temporarily transferred by Franz from Venice are also arriving one after another. But Albrecht was very depressed because the Italian coalition did not enter the battlefield he expected on time. That's right. Tens of thousands of troops are now arriving after a long journey, but not even a single shadow of the Italian coalition forces has been seen. The scouts have dispersed in batches, but there is still no news. The Po River defense line was very strong and was supported by natural dangers, so the general staff felt that 50,000 troops were enough to stop the Italian coalition. Unless they choose to take a detour, but it is not easy for such a large army to take a detour, not to mention the grain carts and horses of hundreds of thousands of people marching. The excrement alone is already astonishing. In addition, central Italy is very mountainous, so it would be extremely difficult for them to take a detour. 3 days ago, in the mountains of Bologna. Blenin was an orphan, but fortunately he was adopted by a nobleman who had no heirs. But unfortunately for him, his stepmother disliked him very much and kicked him out of the house when his adoptive father passed away. However, nobles still have to be decent, so his adoptive mother bought him the rank of major. Although he was a major, he was thrown into the mountains with more than 1,000 people, and it was said that they were asked to guard strategic locations. However, in this quiet place, there are usually no smugglers, and Barlaning has no chance to make contributions. After 5 or 6 consecutive years, he managed to save a small amount of money, which was enough for him to buy dozens of acres of land and hire 2 helpers to become a small landowner in the countryside. On this day, Barlaning watched the sun rise and set as usual. Suddenly a sentry ran back. People. 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 So many people. Arsehole. Did you burn your tongue when you drank the soup? Straighten your tongue and speak, Major. Barlaning has been in the army for many years, and he still has some official authority. Report. There are many people coming to the valley. The sentry talked for a long time without getting to the point. In fact, this was a very common situation at that time, because the quality of most soldiers is very low, except for some people with extraordinary talents. Most people can only use many and very many to describe the number of enemy troops when exploring the enemy's situation. Although they have received special military training, knowing it and being able to use it are completely different concepts. Senior scouts in the army are usually directly linked to the headquarters, and the men under Barlaning are just homeless men in military uniforms. Stop talking. Take me. Barlaning looked helpless. He was really startled when he came to the valley. A large army was slowly advancing in the valley. Although it is a valley, the widest part of the open space in the middle is several hundred meters wide, so the tactic of blocking the road with huge rocks like that used in Switzerland is simply not feasible. At this time, Barlaning was not prepared to retreat. He only knew that there were many people, but he did not know that there was an entire Italian coalition army in the valley. Tell brothers, the stinky beggar from southern Italy is here. Most of Barlaning's troops were northern Italians. Although they were at the bottom of northern Italy, they still looked down on southern Italy. They even felt that it was southern Italians who took their jobs and made their lives miserable. Hearing what the officer said, the sentry instantly became less afraid and looked at the densely packed enemies in the valley with nothing but contempt in his heart. Yes, hearing the sentinel's resounding reply, Bar Lining couldn't help but admire. If you keep your tongue straight, you have a bright future. If you win this battle, you will be promoted to whistle commander. Yes, sentinel. Gino went happily. Bar Lining looked back at the fortress behind him. He felt that the place where he had made great achievements was coming. In fact, what Major Bar Lining didn't know was that the strategic defense map in his hand was from a few years ago. At this time, there were no friendly troops on his flanks and rear flanks, and the closest Po River defense line to him was dozens of kilometers away. Yes, this fortress was ignored. The bad news is that no one informed them to retreat. The good news is that the Italian coalition forces did not know that there was a fortress here. The fortress was built over the years as an outpost of the Austrian-run Bologna, but following a series of secret deals between Metternich and Gregori's V. This outpost suddenly became useless. The Austrians could enter the Papal State openly, so naturally there was no need for this sneaky outpost. However, due to the sudden death of Archbishop Cavaggi on the way over the mountain, the Italian coalition forces fell into a leaderless state. Eventually, after some intrigues and conflagrations, Mr. Pollard, a liberal leader from Tuscany, assumed leadership of the army. According to the intelligence sent previously, the Austrians have built a defense line near the Po River. Mr. Borel used to be a small shopkeeper. He would not jump into a fire pit openly, so he decided to temporarily change the marching route of Archbishop Cavaggi. Instead of taking the main road, he walked through the valley. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 883, 1 cavalry against 1,000. 1,000 against 10,000. 1 is worth 10. He is a true warrior. 1,000 versus 100,000. 1 is equivalent to 100. So 800 are equal. 1,000 is worth 1 million. 1 horse is worth 1,000. After many days of trekking, their food supply was at the bottom. As for the reason, the mountains are high and the rivers are long, which is one aspect. Deliberate delay or failure to do things is another aspect. In short, during the high-intensity march, the Italian coalition's food supply was in short supply or insufficient for a long time. It can be imagined that where a group of hungry men passed by, there must be a lot of resentment among the people, especially in those areas that were once under Austrian rule. But it is precisely because of this that it gave the coalition leaders a very good excuse to collaborate with the enemy and betray the country. The result was that the rebels who participated in the Holy War were like rats crossing the street, and everyone was shouting to beat them before they even reached Austria. The long march was boring and boring. At this time, the coalition soldiers had long lost their original excitement. Coupled with fatigue and hunger, most of them looked listless. As the leader of the army, Borel was naturally displeased when he saw the soldiers looking like this at this time. Some old officers who were good at observing people came over. Mr. Borel, what's bothering you? You know what you're asking. You have something to say. You have something to say. The former small shop owner now has the power of a general. However, these old officers from central Italy have long been accustomed to being submissive, so they still said to Borel with a smile on their face, "Your Excellency Marshal, we have a way to cheer up these lazy idiots." "What can I do? Tell me quickly," Borel asked impatiently. He didn't want these listless soldiers to embarrass him. The officer handed over a riding crop. Borel shook his hands and pointed at the officer's face again, scaring the latter into retreating. Borel threw the riding crop to the officer and smiled. "Haha, that's interesting. Let's go to work." The officer carefully took the riding whip, thought for a while and asked, "What do you mean?" This officer also had his own little thoughts, and he didn't want to take the blame when he didn't know the other person's character. As for whipping soldiers, he was not a sadist who would do such a thing if there were no benefits. Keep them in good spirits, Boral said casually. Several officers looked at each other. It seemed that the other party didn't want to take the blame, and it didn't even have the benefits of the verbal promise. But the power is stronger than the people, so they can only work obediently, and cannot show dissatisfaction. So they vented their grievances on the soldiers. Such an army full of negative emotions was suddenly attacked by the barlaining tribe. Yes, the side with only 1,000 people launched an active attack. In fact, the main reason was that barlaining didn't know how many coalition forces there were in the valley, but he knew very well that the opponent's vanguard was unprepared. At first, barlaining thought this would be a tough battle, but when the gunfire rang out, the battlefield became one-sided. The exhausted team was startled by the sudden sound of gunfire. They looked at their companions lying in a pool of blood at a loss. At this time, the frightened warhorse raised its hooves high and neighed. An officer fell off his horse and shouted, "The enemy is attacking. There is an ambush." As soon as these words came out, the crowd immediately exploded. Obviously only a few people fell, but the impact was like dozens of artillery shells hitting them at the same time. "Run. The Austrian army is coming. This is a trap. Help. God bless. Call the priests. Let them protect us." The chaotic crowd had no discipline at all, and it was more like encountering a patrolman in a brawl than a war. Lenin and his soldiers had no idea what was going on, but they seemed to be winning, and they even launched a charge. The follow-up troops of the Italian coalition were dispersed by their own people before they could engage the enemy, and there were rumors that the main force of the Austrians had arrived. The riding crop in Boral's hand was unable to stop the rout, so he simply fled with him. Such farce was repeated in the next few days. Major Barlanin and his troops repeatedly defeated the Italian coalition forces, which were said to be 1 million, but actually numbered around 250,000. This convinced Boral that the opponent's commander was Archduke Albrecht, and that there were at least 100,000 Austrian troops stationed in that small fortress. Which was why the battle was so difficult. In fact, the tactical literacy of both sides was not very good. The battle was very boring, and had almost no highlights. Major Barlining and others did not know how many of the enemy were there, so they just hid behind the fortress and shot the enemy with rifles and cannons. As for the soldiers, who had exhausted their blood on the Italian coalition side, they just wanted to go home, while the officers were not affiliated with each other and everyone wanted to preserve their strength. As a result, almost all the fighting between the two sides took place 300 meters away, and the Austrian side was still hiding behind the bunker at this distance, let alone the muskets commonly installed by the army at this time. Even modern assault rifles cannot achieve perfect hits against targets with bunkers. In fact, in modern warfare, the hit rate of assault rifles at a distance of 300 meters is less than 1%. In the first 3 days of fighting, the total number of casualties on both sides did not exceed 4 digits. On the 4th day, as the commander-in-chief, Boral sent his cronies and the fierce battle really began. However, neither Boral nor his cronies are actually much different from those before. They are more of a show than fighting. But even so, on the 6th day, Major Barlining found that the artillery shells in the fortress had been exhausted, and there was not even much gunpowder left. As reinforcement failed to arrive, deserters began to appear, and the wounded soldiers drank all the wine in the fortress in order not to let the painful groans affect their morale. Barlining could only find someone to send them out, but most of the soldiers who sent them out would not come back. The remaining soldiers kept complaining about why the reinforcement had not arrived yet, and they were also thinking about a problem. How many people are there on the other side, because the other party came and went again and again, and after so many days of fighting, nothing happened. The same point at this time, Lenin did not want to withdraw. He was not an aristocrat, nor a nationalist, nor an Austrian, but he didn't want to withdraw because he was a soldier, and this identity that only belonged to him, whether it was a noble status or something else, belonged to others. Only the identity of a soldier was his own choice. But at this time he no longer had high hopes for reinforcement. Major Barlining imitated the actors on the stage and said, "Soldiers, you have done your best. I now allow you to withdraw to the rear with your weapons." The soldiers looked at the stumbling major with some helplessness. Apart from being stingy and showing off like his elders, this officer had no bad habit of withholding military pay or beating soldiers. Chapter 884 Fire in the Backyard. Where are you, Mr. Major? I will live and die with this place. Take my sword, soldier, and tell them how the 2nd Infantry Regiment of Udine fought bravely. Mr. Major, your hands are shaking. I drank too much. It's okay, but all the wine was drunk the day before yesterday. Don't you know there is a place called Joaquin, sir? I have never heard of it in the 3 years since I came here. 5 years, 8 years. The other soldiers talked all over the place. HMPH. If I can go back alive, I will definitely take you to see it next time. Major, don't do it again. We are all going to die. Look, the Italian coalition is attacking again. You guys leave quickly. I can delay the city gate for a while longer if I blow it down. Major, Barlining said eagerly, but the others did not respond. The soldiers all picked up their weapons and walked to the top of the city. What are you doing? Do you know how many of them there are? I don't know, but I've fought them off many times, so I can do it this time. A veteran spat out the hard bread in his mouth. The cook ran away, so they had to make their own bread. These soldiers used to eat porridge, a paste made by mixing edible things into a pot and cooking them. The other soldiers also looked indifferent. If we leave now, there will be no military pay. Yes, and if those religious priests rule, the world will become worse. I escaped from the Papal States, and I think my life is pretty good now. We are all the same as you. We are all unwanted people. Only this fortress needs us, and now we are willing to live and die with you, brothers. Before Barlaning could finish his words, he was knocked down by a soldier with a rifle. But carry him and go. A fake nobleman works harder than those real noblemen. We have fought for so many days, and we are worthy of those military salaries. At this time Sentinel Gino ran back. No, no, no. It's not good. Why are you stuttering again? Veteran Yalzi was very angry. I don't have time to fool around with you. My brothers are still busy running for their lives. There are more people behind. Sentinel Gino finally finished his sentence point, but as soon as these words came out, the soldiers immediately went into an uproar. They thought they could still escape, but they didn't expect to be outflanked by the other party. Damn it. Did it with them. At this time, Sentinel Gino spoke again. I can't do it. Why? It's one of our own. Albrecht was not a general who liked defense. In fact, he was just the opposite of his father. He pursued offensive doctrine. That is, offense is the best defense point. When he learned that the soldiers in the Barini Valley fortress were still resisting, Albrecht immediately decided to rush to help. In fact, no officer would give up this opportunity to block the wall. He just judged, based on previous intelligence and his experience, that the Italian coalition forces would get out of the valley before them. That's why Albrecht built the Po River defense line, but at this time he would not let go of the opportunity to beat the dog point. So this time the Italian coalition forces were completely unable to attack, because all Albrecht brought were Austrian regular troops in addition to some elite troops who were already equipped with lever-action rifles. Other troops were also equipped with new rifled guns, which greatly improved the accuracy of shooting. For the first time, the Italian coalition's casualties exceeded 4 digits in one day. More than 200 to 300 corpses were abandoned directly under the walls of Barini Fortress. The gap in equipment, firepower, and training was too great, coupled with the advantages of the fortress, putting the two sides in a completely unequal position. If the valley terrain was not inconvenient for pursuit, Albrecht would have even wanted to expand his victory. It's just that this crazy behavior was stopped by his officers. It wasn't that the officers thought they couldn't win, but that the soldiers who were marching continuously needed a rest. Moreover, in this kind of valley terrain, once the Austrian army chases out, then our own side will be at a disadvantage, and it is better to waste it here. Anyway, the Austrian side has a fortress that can protect them from wind and rain, and the Italians can only pitch tents in the mountains at this time. Borel was already confused. He did not expect that so many people would die in one day, but fortunately, these were not his direct descendants. Although the Austrians achieved a great victory, they did not catch up. What does this prove? It proved that the Austrians were incapable of chasing them out. After thinking about this, Borel no longer panicked. He actually thought this was good. After all, the military power was now in his hands. Anyone who disobeyed him would be sent to death. As a result, the Italian coalition forces were no longer in a hurry to attack, which made Albrecht very confused. Do they have enough supplies? The mountain road is difficult to travel, and there are disasters, which is not enough, but these will definitely not short-circuit the officer, so Bala does not feel too deeply about this. But now a greater disaster is waiting for them. Papal States, Rome. As long as Italy is unable to defend itself, the Austrian government will commit violence, plunder, and rape, and these barbaric soldiers will act indiscriminately, setting fires, killing people, and leaving everything in ruins. I saw Radetzky going to war with the cross of Christ, knocking down the monastery doors, desecrating the altar with his horses, violating the remains of our priests. The Holy See has blessed your swords, and together with Carlo Alberto's army, head north, destroy these enemies of God and Italy, those who insulted Pius IX, desecrated the churches of Mantua, and murdered the monks of Lombardy. Such a civilized war to eliminate barbarians is not only for the country, but also for all Christians. Holy See Secretary of State Jothiel has given his speech countless times. The people are tired of hearing it. They only care about when their families can come back, and when they can have enough to eat. No one knew that the Kingdom of Sardinia had declared neutrality at this time, and was discussing alliance matters with the Austrians. Other countries in the Mediterranean naval battle may think that it was the work of the French, but Carlo Alberto knew very well that it was the Austrian navy that did it. As the saying goes, those who understand current affairs are heroes. Almost at the end of the Mediterranean naval battle, the Kingdom of Sardinia once again announced that it would change its stance and support the Austrian Empire in the next war. At this time, Pius IX was still dreaming of unifying Italy with religious victory, but the Papal State government never thought that the cost of the war would be so huge. In fact, they were already in debt from the first day of the expedition. Now that all the surplus grain in the national treasury has been emptied, they can only increase the war tax. At this time, it was a year of disaster, and ordinary people had no food surplus at home. Adding the war tax was equivalent to forcing people to rebel. And those liberals are even more ridiculous. They still want to make money, and have come up with a bunch of temporary laws as a result. Driven by this freedom, prices in the Papal States skyrocketed, and public dissatisfaction boiled. At this time, the liberal government pointed the finger at Pius IX himself. Chapter 885. The plan 12 years ago. In fact, the liberals of the Papal States were not grateful to Pius IX himself, and even hated him a little. After all, the latter was a representative of the old era. Moreover, the liberal government wanted a constitution, and they felt that this was the best opportunity. Since the troops loyal to Pius IX were no longer around, they had nothing to worry about. But at this time, Pius IX himself was not aware of the approaching crisis. He was still immersed in the tricolour flags flying in the streets and the shouts of "Long live Italy, long live Pius IX." Pius IX was the nominal leader of the Italian coalition at this time. In a sense, it was precisely because of him that he could bridge the conflicts between many parties and organize these unrelated or even mutually hostile people together. In fact, the original Italian nationalist propaganda poster showed the image of a priest wearing a tricolor wide-brimmed hat and holding a sword. Many clergy did join this war for one reason or another, and they also played the role of glue like Pius IX. Without these priests and parish communities, the rebels would never have been able to mobilize such a large team. But this is not important in the eyes of liberals. What they want is real power and a constitution that can protect their power. Pius IX's supporters were not without merit, insisted Vincenzo Giobetti, a businessman in the Papal States. National sentiment and enthusiasm for war are a sword, a weapon, a powerful army. Either His Majesty will have it firmly in his grasp, or the opposition will take it away, and use it against His Majesty and against the Catholic Church. However, Pius IX did not heed Vincenzo Giobetti's warning, but was ostracized because of the latter's opposition to war with Austria. By this time, however, the liberals had bared their fangs, and the business council had drafted a bourgeois constitution to replace the theocratic control of the church. They were sure that this would gain public support, but before that they had to get rid of the biggest trouble, Pius IX himself. The liberals first planned an assassination attempt against Count Pellegrino Rossi. Pius IX's chief security advisor Count Rossi himself was very talented and very good at handling internal crises. It was because of his presence that large-scale uprisings did not break out within the Papal States, but as the old saying goes, the liberals in the Papal States don't care about anything else. They only care about whether it is good for themselves. Then Count Pellegrino Rossi was assassinated in public, ambushed on his way home and fled. But the death of Count Rossi still did not awaken Pius IX. He did not even know about Count Rossi's death. After all, this count usually liked the dragon to be invisible. At the same time, the princes of the Central and Italian states, who were fleeing the war and were forced to flee the war, had gathered in Tyrol. Franz did not allow these people to gather in Vienna as in history. The reason was firstly for security reasons, and secondly to maintain the face of the Habsburg family. Franz did not want these monarchs to see the weak and chaotic side of Austria. He wanted them to see an Austria that was safe, strong, and full of hope. Tyrol is just right at this time. Although this city is not as prosperous as Vienna or as rich as Venice, it has not been affected by the storm. It is safe and stable. This is the most important and rare thing at this time. At the same time, Franz was just in case. Even if the royal family left Vienna, it would not be a refuge, but a visiting relatives. In fact, the monarchs of various states naturally came up with a bold idea, after seeing how peaceful and stable Tyrol was, entrust the Austrian imperial government to help govern their country. This is nothing new. Franz has made this suggestion since the old emperor was still alive. It's just that I thought it was Franz's childish words, and Metternich thought it was the old emperor's intention. Over the years, the entire central Italian bureaucracy has been almost penetrated by Austria. Although this crisis temporarily expelled Austrian officials from central Italy, Franz had already sent people to take them back to Austria in time. All that was lost was some buildings that could not be moved, and Franz would be able to get these back sooner or later. For the monarchs who were taking refuge in Tyrol at this time, they actually didn't have much left to bet on. Rather than letting those domestic liberals and usurpers profit, it would be better to sell their country to the Habsburg family. And they naturally decided to trade with Franz. After all, Franz would be the future emperor, and he had little political experience and was easy to fool. Franz was naturally happy to attend the appointment, and even brought them some Venetian specialties, various rare treasures from overseas, and Neil Manin, the Italian nationalist who gave them a lot of headaches. One of the leaders, Francesco V, Grand Duke of Modena, and Leopold II, Grand Duke of Tuscany, were both members of the Est line of the Habsburg family, so Franz was naturally no stranger to them. Franz was more happy than surprised that he could lead troops to quell the rebellion in Venice, but for Carlo I, who had just inherited the Duchy of Parma, he was more surprised than happy. Francesco V may have been a little ambitious before, but after going through hell, he no longer valued the power in his hands so much. After all, my life is at stake, so what kind of power do I need? This Francesco V was actually one of Franz's backup men to discuss the British. Under the influence of Francis, Francesco V was now Francis I, the legal heir to the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland, supported by the Jacobites. Because of this, Francesco V has been dreaming of uniting Britain. In his plan, he would also land in England like Regent William, and then start his own era. For this reason, Francesco V also established a navy to prepare for his own landing. However, the rebellion at this time shattered his dream. The so-called Jacobites had no power at all, and he himself was an incompetent and weak person. Throughout the revolution, Francesco V first wanted to exploit the nationalists, then wanted to suppress them, and finally had to flee in panic. Leopold II was a monarch who believed in ruling by doing nothing. He completely delegated power to his bureaucrats. Leopold II, like Louis Philippe, liked to flaunt himself as an enlightened liberal, but during the turmoil, his bureaucrats and people drove him out of his country. At this time, Leopold II just wanted to lie down. He had had enough of the bullshit. Carlo I felt that he had noble Bourbon blood and regarded the Habsburg family as his opponent. Not long ago, Carlo I was still dreaming of a double crown. He even thought that it would become a springboard for the Bourbon family to fight for hegemony in Italy. However, Things are unpredictable, and he was driven out by the Parma people before he had time to understand Austria's power in Parma. Chapter 886 Mutation. However, Carlo I was different from Leopold II and Francesco V. He still fantasized about exchanging sovereignty for governance. Dear France, the Duchy of Parma is also willing to accept the protection of Austria, but I feel that I'm born to rule, and I'm more familiar with my duchy. You have also seen that ruling is not a very simple matter, and you may encounter threats just like this time. I think you are more talented in war, and should show off your talents on the battlefield. Leave such boring things to my uncle. What Carlo I said was sincere. If he were a young man who was just starting out, or if he didn't know the other person's details, he would most likely be moved by the other person's words. However, Franz knew very well that Carlo I was unable to manage his own territory well. At the same time, excessive differentiation of political districts would not only increase administrative costs, but also reduce administrative efficiency. What's even more terrible is that a separate political system will affect Franz's plan. I think I'm more talented in politics, but you should receive more military training. If you could lead an army to defeat those disrupting the order, you wouldn't need to come here at this point. Franz's words to Carlo I were very sharp. To be honest, he didn't want to give an honest impression to such a man who acted according to the circumstances, because this may be used as a weakness by the other party. When friends come, they have wine, and when enemies come, they have knives. Only in this way can the relationship be harmonious. Although Franz's words were a bit harsh, they were also true, and the situation was stronger than the people, so Carlo I had no choice. At this time, he could only rely on the Austrian Empire to regain lost territory. As for his cousin Louis Philippe and his France, they were already a thing of the past. Carlo I reluctantly signed his name on a trusteeship document that Franz had prepared long ago. In fact, Franz's methods have been very gentle. With the chaos outside now, it is normal for one or two dukes to have accidents in this way. Not only can you save money, but you can also avoid a subsequent fee. Franz did not seize power directly, but asked them to use their territories as capital to invest in Austrian causes. In this way, as long as the Austrian Empire exists, they will have a good life without having to worry about their livelihood and safety. At the same time, the stronger and richer Austria is, the better their lives will be. On the contrary, as long as they have enough ability, they can also receive Austria's inheritance, but then it will all depend on their ability. The perspective returns to the Papal States. Pius IX's control over the government was gradually declining, and the liberals attributed the people's dire situation to his blind declaration of war on Austria. In fact, when the British Mediterranean fleet was completely annihilated, and the city of Rome was directly exposed to Austrian firepower, liberals began to become anti-war factions. The liberals, who had previously aligned themselves with the nationalists and prepared to join hands to unify Italy, now see that the situation is over, and they will not bury the losers with them. As a result, the House of Commons, which Pius IX personally ordered to be established, actually openly opposed him. At this time, Pius IX could no longer take back the power of the parliament. What is even more frightening is that in order to bring about the rapid fall of Pius IX, the liberal government began to spread the news of the defection of the Kingdom of Sardinia and the failure of the British. These two pieces of information were originally kept strictly confidential. After all, no matter how stupid the priests of the Papal States were, they would not be unaware of the evil consequences they could bring. Compared with the failure of the British, the defection of the Kingdom of Sardinia had a greater impact on Italy. In fact, the reason for this is not that the Kingdom of Sardinia is more powerful than the British, but that most people do not have high expectations for the British. After all, the war between Italy and Austria was mainly a land war. However, these two things exploded among the top leaders. Carlo Alberto betrayed Italy, the British Armada was completely annihilated, and even Crete was occupied by Austria. How can an army of hundreds of thousands of people be defeated just because they say they are defeated? Pius IX mused, and he didn't notice that there weren't many people around him anymore. At this time, he received another bad news. Archbishop Corrigi died of illness. The succession of bad news made Pius IX somewhat overwhelmed, but he did not have the chance to grieve. People were angered by the successive failures coupled with the accumulated resentment from previous tax increases, the people who had previously affectionately called Pius IX Pio Nono had now taken up torches and paint point. At this time, most of the troops of the Papal State had been dispatched, and Count Rossi, who was responsible for city security and mutual coordination, was assassinated. Point as for Lord Jottel, Secretary of State of the Holy See, he can sit in this position, mainly because of his brother's status. From the beginning of the parade to the burning of the palace, it took only one morning, and the credit of the liberals was naturally indispensable. Point under the banner of a public club, they joined the parade with the citizen guard, and even had drummers and bands as accompaniment. Point when the first fire was lit, it was out of control. It was not only the huge palace that was ignited, but also the long suppressed anger in people's hearts. Someone sets a fire, and someone puts out the fire. The Swiss guards, who were loyal to their duties, came to put out the fire. The marching crowd tried to stop the Swiss guards, but both sides refused to give in. Point as a result, someone fired first during the chaos, and a marcher was knocked down, followed by even greater chaos. Since the civil guards were among the parade, the two sides immediately exchanged fire. Point the battle between the two sides did not suffer much losses, but it affected a large number of citizens. When Pius IX learned of this, the whole street was stained with blood. Point Father Antonio urged the Holy See to leave, because he had an ominous premonition. Your Majesty, given the current situation, I think it is very possible that what happened in France and Austria will happen to us. This is impossible. They support us. They support revolution. Now you stand in their way and they want to revolutionize you. Father Antonio said bluntly, which outraged Pius IX. No, let me tell you, I'm different from those monarchs. I'm God's representative on earth. If they fight against me, they are violating God's will. Wake up. Look outside. There is fire and blood everywhere. Those prisoners you released formed an army with your permission. Point, and you sent all your loyal troops to Venice, and now only the Swiss are still fighting for you. Point you go quickly. Can't you hear the shots getting closer? Father Antonio continued to persuade him earnestly. I won't leave. I'm the Pope. Go and tell them that, as long as we defeat the traitors in Austria and Sardinia, our good days will come. There will be bread and red wine. At this time, there was a deafening loud noise, and accompanied by the sound of shattering glass, a solid bullet flew in, crushing Father Antonio's head in front of Pius IX. Chapter 887 Escape. When the guards and servants rushed into the room, they found that the originally white bishop's robes of Pius IX were stained with blood. Point however, the cannonball did not hurt the Pope himself. He just looked a little confused and in disbelief. His Majesty the Pope. Let's run away. The Consultative Council and the Civil Guard have rebelled, and they are about to rush in. Captain Stefan Capella shouted that, although he was a Swiss mercenary, he had served the Papal States for 30 years, and several popes had treated him well. So what Captain Stefan said at this time, it's true. Point however, Pius IX refused. He did not want to leave. Change my clothes. I want to see my flock. No, my people. Although Pius IX was dressed in a mess, his demeanor at this time was like that of a real pope. Several servants were also infected by this momentum. They acted quickly, and soon Pius IX changed into a clean robe, and the blood on his face and hair was wiped away. At this time, Swiss mercenaries as foreigners outside the palace were defending the place, while the attackers were the Roman citizen guard. The fighting between the two sides was no different from a large-scale gang fight. The Swiss mercenaries hid behind flower beds and marble statues, while the Roman civil guards could only knock down vendors' carts or stalls to use as bunkers. However, this balance was broken the moment the citizen guard brought the cannon. However, since there were no professional artillery, the cannonballs directly crossed the Swiss mercenary defense line and shot into the palace. Artillery cannot be transported in a short time, which means that the liberals have brought artillery to the parade early in the morning. They are determined to oust Pius IX from power. Angelone Beauty was the soul of the Roman Citizen Consultative Committee at this time. He also came to the palace of Pius IX and urged the artillery to be replenished quickly. In fact, this so-called artilleryman was not professional. After the first shell was fired, the gun barrel was almost exploded because it was too full of gunpowder. Now they had to clean the gun barrel again. At this time, the palace door slowly opened, and Pius IX walked out in front of everyone's surprised eyes. Children, treat the injured, don't let innocent blood continue to flow in vain. At this time, if someone else had said such an unsavory word, 80% of them would have been shot to pieces, but it would be different if it were the Pope. The two sides actually ceased fire, and the onlookers were a little at a loss. But Angelona Beauty would not allow Pius IX to remain in control. He shouted, "Fire! Kill the culprit and everything will be over." However, everyone was confused. A soldier from the civil guard said, "That's the Pope. If you kill him, will you go to hell?" Angelo Beauty angrily grabbed the gun and shouted to his cronies, "Shoot him." A burst of gunfire rang out. Smoke filled the air. It was related to the gunpowder at that time, and the smoke was very large, and there was a burst of exclamation from the crowd. Although not many people really like the Pope, it still makes people feel incredible when someone actually shoots at the Pope. The Pope is, after all, the ruler of the Papal States and the theoretical spiritual leader. But when the smoke cleared, people discovered that Pius IX was still standing where he was, unscathed. Oh my God. Miracle. The people began to pray one after another, and the soldiers of the citizen guard also joined them. In fact, this is not really a blessing from the gods, but the accuracy of muskets at long distances is not good, and Angelona Beauty and his cronies are not sharpshooters. Missing a shot is a very normal thing, but in the eyes of ordinary people, it is a miracle. Life is so difficult, people naturally hope that heaven is real. But Angelona Beauty doesn't believe in this evil. If he really believed in this, he wouldn't be able to rebel. Angelona Beauty wanted to continue shooting, but the reloading speed of rifles in this era was too slow, so he could only continue to grab the gun. Angelona Beauty grabbed another rifle. This time he wanted to aim before firing, but the surrounding people and the civil guard stopped him. "Mr. Angelo, no, you will go to hell. We just want to have a good meal. Now that the Pope is out, let's have a good talk." Trash. Stupid. Give me the gun. After all, Angelona Beauty couldn't win over the people, so he could only stomp away angrily. An hour later, Quirinal Palace. 13 cardinals in Rome and liberals in the government gathered together, and Pius IX was also present. In order to end the rebellion, the church is willing to make concessions, but it still needs to listen to the opinions of liberals first. After all, accepting it in full may lead to a greater crisis. The liberal demand was simply that the authoritative laws of the Papal States be replaced by their constitution, with government officials elected. As for the Pope, he is still the religious leader of the Papal States and enjoys the same respected status as other royal families. This is simply unacceptable to the authority of the Papal States, especially the fact that the Pope is equated with the monarchs of other countries. This setting is obviously a big pitfall. However, what was really unacceptable to Pius IX was the electoral system. He could not accept that his identity and power were tarnished. In fact, more importantly, he was afraid of the election itself. Pius IX had no confidence in his people, and no confidence in himself. But in fact, the reputation of liberals at this time is really not much better. They buy low, sell high, and hoard. If it were not for the government, they would be liquidated. First point. Although the Pope is the spiritual leader to the entire Catholic world, to the Romans he is just the Bishop of Rome. Italian joke, but at this time, Pius IX and the church still had a very strong influence among the people. If it were a universal suffrage, the liberals would definitely be defeated. But what the liberals want is limited elections, that is, property elections, so that they can have exclusive power. Their so-called freedom has always been a luxury for a few people. In this way, the first day of negotiations between the two parties made no progress. Most liberals were happy to be able to talk to those high-ranking bishops in the past. However, Angelona Beauty was not such an unmotivated person, and he did not want to give Pius IX a chance to redeem himself. On the other side, Pius IX summoned the French and Spanish ambassadors overnight. On that day, a man wearing a low-level priest's robe boarded the carriage under the cover of darkness, along with 2 large carts of personal belongings. Before dawn the next day, Angelona Beauty and his cronies took advantage of the opportunity of negotiation. to rush into the Pope's palace with guns, but did not find Pierre-Six Point. In fact, in addition to the Pope, several cardinals and their cronies were also missing. Standing on the side of the ship, Pius IX looked back at the Eternal City, Rome. He felt angry and ashamed. Pius IX decided to take back everything he had, by force, and so the ship sailed for Tuscany. Because it was the closest to the front line, he wanted to use the Italian coalition to retake the holy city of Rome. Chapter 888. Where to go? On the Bologna front, Borel was tapping the table impatiently. Because supplies have not arrived, the Italian coalition forces have run out of food. Coupled with the fact that there was no progress in the frontline war, he couldn't help but curse. In fact, Borel had scolded everyone he met, but the anxiety in his heart still could not be eliminated. The Austrians had no intention of attacking at all, and his army could not attack at all. The gap in combat effectiveness between the two sides was too great. And the gap grew wider as time went on, as Austria received the artillery and rockets they so desperately needed. On the other hand, Bala did not wait for the food he needed, but instead waited for a huge bad news. Pius IX and his cardinals came to the front line for unknown reasons, and they also wanted to take over the military power in his hands. Lapor couldn't bear this. He didn't want to go back to being the little shopkeeper who needed to please others. He wanted to be a general. As a result, Pius IX was ambushed as soon as he left the city. Fortunately, the Swiss guards around him fought bravely and survived. However, the two secretary bishops who were traveling with him were not so lucky. They had turned into two corpses on the roadside outside the city. At this time, a group of soldiers claimed to be sent by Marshal Pollard to escort Pius IX to the military camp. The Pope himself felt very pleased. Thank God for giving us such a loyal general, and may the Lord bless you. Amen. After Pius IX finished speaking, he was about to board the carriage and go with them, but was stopped by Stefan Capella, the captain of the guard on the side. His Majesty the Pope, you said that you would pray for the children and the orphanage tomorrow, so we should start again tomorrow. Pius IX was a little surprised when he said such words, but he quickly understood the intention of his guard captain. Well, those orphans are indeed pitiful. They need me. Let's set off tomorrow. The captain who came to pick up the Pope was in a bit of trouble. His Majesty the Pope, Marshal Borel is afraid of long nights and dreams, so you should leave with us as soon as possible. It is not safe here, and traitors from Austria and Rome may be against you. No need to worry, I'm God's representative on earth. They can't hurt me. Pius IX was extremely confident when he said this, which made the captain very embarrassed. Pius IX also saw this and said, don't worry, I will tell Borel of your bravery and devotion to duty. I will also make you the leader of the regiment in the future. No one would doubt that Pius IX had this ability, but there was no joy on the captain's face, only a fake smile full of embarrassment. His subconscious behavior led Pius IX and Captain Stefan to conclude that there must be something wrong with him. The captain then repeatedly insisted that Pius IX go on the road, but the only answer he received was tomorrow. Back at the church's hotel in Tuscany, guard Captain Stefan Capella expressed his judgment. There's something wrong with that guy, and there's a guy in his group who looks a lot like the gangster that attacked us before. Pius IX closed his eyes and nodded. When Captain Stefan saw that the Pope didn't say anything, he continued, His Majesty the Pope, there are only a few hundred gendarmes in Viareggio at this time. If Lapo really wants to harm you, he can send a larger force to rush in directly. Tuscans won't fight for you. This sentence made Pius IX's cheeks twitch, but there were not many people around him who could use him, and the previous events in Rome were still fresh in his mind, so he just coughed. Captain Stefan also realized that his words were inappropriate, scratched his head to apologize, and then asked, should we go to France or Spain? Pius IX thought about this issue for a long time. At this time, the Orleans dynasty in France had collapsed. The diplomat of the Orleans dynasty who really went to France might not be able to protect himself, let alone the Pope. It would be even more shameful if he really became a prisoner in Avignon. Rather than ceding land, to pay compensation and being imprisoned. He would have been better off dying outside. Historically, there had been large-scale turmoil in the Papal States, and coupled with the management of the French, the Holy See was moved from Rome to Avignon, a city close to the French border, known in history as the Prison of Avignon, as, for Spain, Pius IX could not count on it. Not to mention that the church there used the banner of the Jesuits to impose excessive taxes, but it took the lead in defaulting on the tithe that should be paid to the Vatican. The civil war and uprisings raging in Spain at this time alone were too much for him to accept, and Spanish Queen Regent Christiana was famously morally bankrupt. As soon as the Orleans dynasty collapsed, she tore up the engagement between her daughter and Louis Philippe's son, as well as the IOUs for loans from France. Over the years, the bankers who had been indifferent during the fall of the Orleans dynasty were filled with regret. And at this time, the Spanish royal family, the scandals between Queen Regent Christiana and her lover, and her daughter and her lover could already write a novel. The remaining Brazil and Mexico are not even within the scope of consideration, because their ships will definitely not be able to sail across continents. Going to England was also not a good idea, because 2 consecutive British ambassadors had been very rude, and Pius IX felt that this was an uncultivated country. Moreover, they also defaulted on the church's tithes, and even created their own Anglican church, which was simply treason. Seeing Pius IX frowning and not speaking for a long time, Captain Stefan asked eagerly, "His Majesty the Pope, what should we do? Please give me your holy judgment." "Go to Venice." Pius IX looked at his most trusted chief exorcist with wide eyes and disbelief. "Archduke, Franz wants to see you. He is a truly great being. He has already understood everything in this world." For the first time, a look of admiration appeared on the chief exorcist's cold face. At this time, Franz was happily returning to Venice after negotiating a big business, and he also brought an army with him. The Hainaut department stationed in Salzburg. It is a bit humiliating to allow these proud soldiers to continue to defend the Bavarians in Salzburg. After all, Bavaria could not protect itself at this time, so where could it find the courage to attack Austria? Franz was prepared to use this force to put an end to the rebellion that defined Italy in one fell swoop, while also bringing an end to the farce of the Italian coalition. However, in view of Hainaut's disgusting reputation in history, he set 9 precautions and 21 catch-all rules for it. After all, Austria still needs its reputation. If this hungry wolf is allowed to kill without hesitation, then Franz's plan and the old emperor's dream will be ruined. The Italian problem must be solved quickly, because the Hungarians are pressing too hard, and the Bohemians are also committing crimes against the wind. The most important thing is that the British cannot be allowed to continue to delve deeper into the Italian issue, and the two sides must reconcile as soon as possible. Although Franz had already sent people to Russia to clarify the interests, and Olga was very willing to help convince his father and brother, Russian diplomacy was extremely uncertain and arbitrary. In order to reduce risks, reaching a peace agreement directly with the British is the safest option. Chapter 889. Keep moving forward, but on 039 T-shoot. On the way back to Venice, Franz was going to take a nap. After all, there were still a lot of troublesome things to deal with later. The news coming back from Berlin was that the situation in Prussia was not much better than that in Austria. Revolutionary waves also swept through Berlin, and Frederick William IV learned the lessons of the previous zoo tragedy. This time he mobilized 30,000 troops to Berlin, bringing the total number of troops at William IV's disposal to 50,000. However, Metternich's early resignation and the chaos in Vienna made William IV feel no sense of security at all. Originally, he hoped to get the Austrians to help Prussia share the pressure, but Vienna fell first. At the same time, serious differences arose between the two major factions within the Prussian government. The hardline faction was represented by War Minister Kanitz, who insisted on suppressing the Berlin Revolution. The reason is simple. The Austrians have already compromised. The result is the resignation of the Prime Minister, frequent changes in government, domestic political chaos, coveting by many external forces, and even direct competition. The bloodshed in the zoo cannot be in vain. They must be made to understand their status. We must not let those with low blood sit on our heads. Although The junker landowners have been transforming into bourgeois farmers over the years, and the power of the nobility has become smaller and smaller. They still do not want more people to threaten their status, do you want the tragedy of France to happen in Prussia? Prime Minister Ludolf Kamforsen asked rhetorically. Generally speaking, the status of a country's prime minister is higher than that of the minister of war, but Prussia is obviously an exception at this time. Ludolf Kamforsen was a Prussian banker who participated in the founding of the Rheinische and was the founder of the Deutsche Navigation Line. He made his fortune neither from the family's banking business nor from trucking, but from transporting highly qualified German immigrants to North America and the British colonies. Both countries pay him high intermediary fees every year, so Ludolf Kamforsen is a typical pro-British faction. Although under Franz's promotion, the German Confederation promulgated the Anti-Human Trafficking Act and the Anti-Human Smuggling Agreement, and even directly sent warships to intercept smuggling ships, but these methods were of no use to Ludolf Kamforsen, who had an official background, and he could be said to be a job introduction or labor dispatch. In short, he was innocent. Even if Franz wants to use tough measures, he is taking the Northern Sea route, and the Austrian Navy in the Mediterranean is powerless. As for the navies of other countries, it can only be said that they are more than willing, but not powerful enough. Ludolf Kamforsen's goal was to imitate the United Kingdom and establish a constitutional monarchy, so the public's call for a constitution at this time was relatively welcome. This is Berlin, not Paris, and I'm not the weak Marquis de Lafayette. Have we not learned enough lessons from the zoo tragedy? Glach had only 1,000 men and only rifles. Now we have 50,000 men and cannons. There's no reason those mobs can beat us. The hardliners and capitulationists were at loggerheads, and Frederick William IV had no idea. He neither wanted to hand over power nor bear the reputation of massacring people, and was even more afraid of failure. Such an argument would naturally go nowhere, suddenly said Finance Minister Friedrich List. Marshal Kanitz, your army can indeed defeat the people of Berlin, but what happens after the victory? Do you want to kill them all? The Minister of War had no choice but to keep his mouth shut. He knew that he could not really kill all the people. Friedrich List then turned to Ludolf Kamforsen, Prime Minister. If we are too weak, then we will be like Bavaria and Baden, and those nationalists will ride on our heads. My suggestion is to convene a parliament of the United Provinces of Prussia. We can transfer some powers, but they must also pay a certain price. First of all, we must stop the civil strife and not allow the Rhineland to become independent from our country. Secondly, they also need to agree to raise taxes so that we have enough power to deal with the current crisis. Frederick William IV nodded after hearing this. Finally, one of his important ministers started from the perspective of the country, and he appreciated this Württemberg man more and more. But what Frederick William IV did not know was that Friedrich List was the largest liberal in the Prussian government. The Assembly of the United Provinces of Prussia was theoretically the representative body of the people of Prussia, but several generations of Prussian kings failed to fulfill this promise. At the same time, due to the relationship between the Archbishop of Cologne and the Church, the situation in the Rhineland was indeed more severe at this time. The result was already obvious. King Friedrich William IV was more partial to Friedrich List's plan. Although Kanitz was dissatisfied, there was no point in arguing further. The original intention of the Berlin government was to kick the ball back to the nationalists, but the nationalists in the Rhineland and the nationalists in East Prussia were not the same group of people at all. Friedrich List also miscalculated on this point. He did not expect that those people would give up the opportunity to establish a constitution for a mere religious conflict. They directly rejected the Berlin government's proposal, and then uprisings broke out in both places. In the end, Berlin still did not escape the disaster. The army and the people fought in the streets, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. Barricades are a commonplace issue in this era, but the reality is that the weapons at this time really have no good way to deal with such crude fortifications. The soldiers could only endure huge casualties and win one position after another in hand-to-hand combat. These soldiers from the three new provinces in eastern Prussia had no good impression of the concept of Germans. Coupled with the huge number of casualties at this time, they could easily become red-blooded. The soldiers brought the cannon close to the barricade and fired. The terrifying shells easily penetrated the barricades piled up with wooden furniture. In order to suppress this rebellion, Kanitz also purchased special shotguns and even incendiary bombs from Austria. The use of these weapons greatly reduced the casualties of the Prussian army, but street fighting was still very cruel. Unable to distinguish between resistors and civilians, Kanitz's soldiers suppressed them room by room. A large number of accidental injuries and killings were inevitable, which aroused more people's resistance. The morale of the soldiers was low and their mood was low, but there was no doubt that both sides were going crazy. Bodies littered the streets, houses burst into flames, and Berliners recoiled from the infernal scene. They did not have the courage of the Parisians, and the Prussian army emphasized discipline more. These troops from the east were not sympathetic to the people, and would not be directly incited to rebel like the French army. Berlin, Charlottenburg Palace. Frederick William IV felt betrayed and muttered to himself, "Bunch of damn traitors." But when Kanitz came to ask for his approval for further action, Frederick William IV said, "Keep going, but don't shoot." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 890 Schleswig. This put Kanitz in a bit of a dilemma, because he had tried not to fire before, but the cost of hand-to-hand combat was too high. Moreover, the people's will is surprisingly tenacious. If they really relied on bayonets, thousands of troops would be lost every day. Soldiers are also human beings. They are not a group of puppets that can be manipulated at will. They also have tempers and resentments. If this method of risking death is continued, deserters and disobedience on the battlefield will occur at least, and mutiny will occur at worst. If civil unrest escalates to military unrest, the situation will become difficult to control. If the French had not had the support of the army, Louis XVI might not have been guillotined. It was impossible for Kanitz to actually carry out William IV's orders, and of course it was impossible for him to directly disobey them. So the Prussian Minister of War fell ill, and no one was willing to take his place at this critical moment. In fact, this is easy to understand. No one wants to take the blame. The king said not to shoot, but how can we fight a war without shooting, if the damage without shooting is too great? Even if the king does not pursue the case, those soldiers will not let the successor go. If the shooting caused too many casualties, then His Majesty the king would most likely push him out, to take the blame, to appease the public's anger. So everyone chose silence, and Frederick William IV chose to compromise out of desperation. The soldiers stopped attacking, and began to collect the bodies and return to their camps. However, angry people once again took to the streets, and dumped the body in front of the palace. Flowers, coffins, mutilated corpses, angry people, ancient palaces, and the unsmiling soldiers in front of its doors outline a strong picture. In the end, William IV could only come forward and read to my dear Berliners in person. He felt very shameful, but this was the best solution at this time. Later, William IV attended the funeral of the victims. He rode a horse with a black, red, and yellow ribbon on his body and personally apologized to the victims and the people of Berlin. Black, red, and yellow symbolized revolution in the German region at that time. The tricolor flag. William IV said many strange things in public. "I have colors that are not one of those colors, but I don't want a crown, and I don't want to rule. What I want is German freedom, German unity. What I want is order. From today Prussia joins Germany." The people did not understand, but they knew they had won, because the king would convene the United Provinces Assembly to discuss constitutional matters. But soon the German nationalists in Prussia made an even more exaggerated demand. They hoped that the king would fulfill his promise to unify Germany. When the nationalist representatives in Berlin made this request to Wilhelm IV, the latter was startled, and he immediately thought of sending troops to Austria. However, although Austria was at war on all sides at this time, it did not show any signs of fatigue, and it was difficult for Prussia to send troops to guarantee the reaction of Austria's allies. But if we can really dismember Austria, the strongest opponent, in one battle, then it will be worth paying, no matter how high the price is. However, the Prussian nationalists did not want him to go to war with Austria, but demanded the recovery of the two principalities of Schleswig and Holstein occupied by the Danes. In fact, nationalism in the German region also affected Denmark, and Danish nationalists were even more extreme. They took advantage of the old king's critical illness and threatened to refuse to recognize the new king, forcing him to sign a new parliamentary law. The new parliamentary law stipulates that the parliament enjoys all political, military, judicial, financial and other powers. The new King Frederick VII was forced to accept all these and become the puppet of the parliament. Danish nationalists took control of the parliament, and in the king's name they demanded the annexation of the area north of the Ida River, Schleswig. This aroused strong dissatisfaction among German nationalists, because according to the 1460 agreement, the Danish royal family was in charge of the two principalities of Schleswig and Holstein on the premise that the two principalities would never be divided. And although Schleswig is mainly Danish, there are also a large number of Germans living there. The actions of the Danish parliament were directly rebutted by the German nationalists, but these people suffered from the fact that they did not have strong enough arms at this time. William IV's surrender gave them hope, and Prussia was pushed to the forefront of the war with Denmark. However, the Danish government is not all nationalists. Some of them are very clear-headed. At this time, the Kingdom of Denmark is no longer the Nordic hegemon it once was, and the German Confederation has demonstrated its strong strength and cohesion in many recent foreign wars. This group of people felt that the Danish government should not provoke the German Confederation, because the former had no chance of winning. Some people even think that Denmark is doing well in the German Confederation, and that Denmark should join this more promising organization as a whole. However, the passion of Danish nationalists had not dissipated at this time, and they overthrew the relatively conservative government with a grand demonstration. It was replaced by the hardline Oral Lemon cabinet. On the one hand, they began to attack the domestic aristocracy, and on the other hand, they declared that Schleswig and Denmark were unified under a common free constitution. With the promulgation of the new parliamentary law, the confidence of the Danish nobility was severely hit, and no one dared to stand up against Oral Lemon's actions. At the same time, this representative figure of the hardliners is not just a reckless man. He knows very well that Denmark is still an agricultural country at this time. If he wants political stability and more support, he must win over farmers. At this time, the Danish government enacted a series of actions that were almost to please the farmers, which seriously affected the rights of the nobles, but they did gain the support of the farmers. As soon as the Oral Lemon government's conscription order was issued, farmers enthusiastically participated, and the Danish army instantly expanded from 20,000 to 80,000, but he was still not prepared to use force to solve the problem. The Danes held a referendum in Schleswig, preparing to legally and voluntarily incorporate it into Denmark. As a result, the German nobles in Kiel directly declared independence, and German nationalists in other countries also donated money and materials, and even went directly to the battlefield. The nationalists of the German Confederation passed a resolution to declare war on Denmark at the Congress, and assigned the Kingdom of Prussia and the Duchy of Hanover to fight the Danes. As for why Austria is not allowed to send troops, they are just fanatical but not stupid. At this time, Austria is suffering from internal and external troubles, and can still send troops to attack Denmark. And the most important thing is that there is no representative in the German Confederation who is qualified to represent Austria. At this time, the Austrian government was worried about internal and external problems, and did not send a representative to Frankfurt at all. Austria's civilian representatives look down on each other, and they don't recognize each other as being able to represent Austria. As a result, the nationalists of the German Confederation could only temporarily recruit Archduke John to make up the numbers. Although Archduke John was a celebrity in the Austrian royal family, he had long given up his royal status because of his beauty, so in fact he could not representing Austria. Frederick William IV did not take Denmark's opponents seriously at first. Although the latter temporarily recruited tens of thousands of farmers and patriotic youths to join the army, there should be no chance of winning in a real fight with the Prussian regular army. However, what he didn't know was that the Prussian army entered Denmark on the front foot and triggered an international crisis on the back foot. Chapter 891. The Tsar hopes to shed more blood. In the opinion of Frederick William IV, this was a war between Prussia or the German Confederation and Denmark. But in fact, Britain, Russia, and Sweden all expressed strong dissatisfaction with this, and even France planned to get involved. The British did not want the Prussians to rush out of the Baltic Sea, but the Russians had their own ambitions for Schleswig, which had the port that the Russians dreamed of. At the same time, Denmark also controls the throat of the Baltic Sea. Britain and Russia will not give up here either for their own strategic needs or for world hegemony. In particular, Russia has a deep connection with it, and even the Tsar himself has the titles of Schleswig, Holstein and Oldenburg. This theoretically gave Russia the possibility to acquire this area. Naturally, the Tsar would not want the powerful German Confederation or Prussia to acquire this area. In contrast, Denmark, a weak suzerain state, rules a region full of contradictions and is more in line with Russia's interests. Sweden, on the other hand, cannot tolerate Prussia or Germany encroaching on Danish land, whether from the perspective of strategic offense or strategic defense. Denmark is the only possible direction for Sweden's expansion. At this time, and at the same time, it has a close relationship with Denmark. It is definitely not in Sweden's interests to let a powerful country occupy the position of Jutland. Although Denmark covets Norway, its national power is declining, especially after the navy was destroyed by the British. It has not been able to recover for decades. It has a serious financial deficit and even had to sell its colonies to survive the crisis. Kattegat, Sundstrait, Great Belt, Little Belt. Denmark controls all the waterways of the Baltic Sea. Once these important waterways change hands, the Kingdom of Sweden's own maritime economy and security will be under huge threat. Therefore, Sweden is also the most active country. Instead of protesting or issuing notes, they directly dispatch volunteers and warships to assist the Danes in fighting, and even nationalist sentiment in Sweden has been alleviated. Sweden was also affected by nationalism at this time, but the Viking pirates were still relatively ferocious. Two Swedish nationalist leaders in Stockholm also wanted to imitate the French and hold a banquet. After learning about it, the gendarmes immediately surrounded the manor where the banquet was held. The Swedish government did not give the other side a chance to surrender. The army was ordered to completely eliminate the target. As a result, all 37 people in the manor, including servants, were killed. Similar incidents occurred later, but the government's attitude remained tough, but the effect was immediate. The arrogance of nationalists in Sweden was much worse than that in other parts of Europe. However, this does not mean that Sweden is not troubled by nationalism. In fact, those people have used more secretive methods to infiltrate the Swedish government. This was difficult to eliminate, but fortunately, the First Schleswig War broke out at this time, and the Swedish government immediately organized volunteers to participate in the war, and linked it to the fate of the entire Swedish nation. The vast majority of nationalists gave up their domestic struggle in Sweden, and went to the front line against Prussia. The Russian ambassador to Prussia expressed opposition at the time, and when the news reached St. Petersburg, travel was now open in spring. The Tsar was so angry that he almost smashed the table. In Nicholas I's mind, Schleswig was already a Russian territory, and he immediately summoned his advisors. In fact, Russian civil servants and generals were very much like Nicholas I's personal advisors. They could not make decisions that were solely under the Tsar's power, but the situation still had to change. The Prussians actually want to get involved in Schleswig. It is simply wishful thinking. The new Prime Minister Vasily Levav said with a hint of flattery. It is difficult to be a civil servant in Russia, but it is even harder to be the Prime Minister. Not only did his power be pitifully small, but his status was also very low. Not only did he have no dignity in front of the Tsar, he also had no dignity in front of the military attachés. The former Prime Minister Hilarion was sent to Siberia by Nicholas I because of a trivial matter. His life and death are still uncertain. Vasily Levav had decided to give up his dignity as a civil servant and focus on pleasing the emperor, but he didn't realize that Nicholas I despised those spineless people the most. You think Prussia is incapable of taking Schleswig, Nicholas? I said coldly, and Vasily Levov was suddenly at a loss. He didn't know what he had done wrong. No, I just want to say, then do you think the Danes can hold on? I don't. Then what do you want to say, Nicholas? I suddenly shouted loudly, causing the former to fall to the ground in fright, and the general beside him burst into mocking laughter. Vasily Levov was angry, but he didn't know what to do, because dignity was not as important as life. However, from the way that Tsar looked at him, Vasily Levov knew that, if he didn't do something now, he would be dead. At this time, someone gave Vasily Levov a hand. The person who came was a young man. He patted the dust on himself for the somewhat downtrodden prime minister. The Danes may not be able to hold it, but the British, Swedes, even the French and Austrians will not want the Prussians to take Schleswig, Nicholas. I looked at the young man in front of him with great admiration. Very well, Andrei is right. We are not the only ones who don't want Prussia to take Schleswig. You continue. Thank you, Your Majesty. We just have to make our position clear, and the British and Swedes will take care of it for us. What we have to deal with now are the Poles and Chechens in the country. They are like two cancers eroding our national strength. In fact, Franz's win caused more trouble for the Russians than he imagined. Although the supply of the Chechens was cut off by Franz, they were much stronger than imagined. And because Franz's early funding caused much greater losses to the Russians, the historical scene in which the Tsar threatened the French provisional government to send troops did not take place. Nicholas's brows softened slightly. This was what he was thinking about. In fact, he was considering whether to send troops to Schleswig, because Russia's military strength was too stretched at this time. Not only Chechnya, but also a series of small-scale uprisings broke out in Poland. The new Polish Governor General Wimborowski was a romantic poet general, but his methods were anything but gentle. By this time the Polish restorers had evolved after the disastrous defeat in Galicia, and they began to seek cooperation with workers and serfs. These Polish restorers have realized that the few nobles and capitalists alone cannot defeat the powerful Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So they changed some strategies and began to look for foreigners who were sympathetic to the Poles. At the same time, they also learned to spread the pie for workers and farmers. For example, after the establishment of the Polish Federation, there will be no more repression, no more overtime, and no more arrears of wages. Chapter 890. To the anxious British. In fact, the Polish restorers were not sure whether this trick was effective. Russian Poland was their first test subject. Facts have proved that strength in numbers is indeed great, and the Russians were greatly deceived by the Polish and Russian serfs who rose up in rebellion. The Poles decided to continue to copy their successful experience to deal with Prussia and Austria. The already unstable situation in Prussian Poland became even more volatile, but this strategy was of little use in Galicia. On the one hand, Franz's previous public trial had made the Polish nationalist army notorious, and at the same time, the residual power of Austria's bloody suppression was still there. On the other hand, many former Polish serfs have become vested interests at this time, and they no longer need to fight for others at the same time. Out of considerations of safeguarding their own interests, they are unwilling to continue to wade into the muddy waters of Polish Zionism. These people will spontaneously begin to study a set of theories on the rationality of Austria's rule in Galicia, which is the conscious safeguarding of national interests that the rulers aspire to. So Nicholas, I patted Andrei Uvarov on the shoulder. I'll leave Schleswig's affairs to you. But, as soon as the Tsar's accent rose, Andrei Uvarov received it. Don't let the Danes annex Schleswig, nor the British or Swedes. It belongs to us, Russia, Nicholas. I laughed loudly. Well said. Go ahead and do it, my boy. I will appoint you as my plenipotentiary. Thank you, Your Majesty. But during my absence, I hope you can listen more to the Prime Minister's advice. He is one of the few politicians in Russia. He may be able to help you coordinate our domestic relations. Our Russian army is not afraid of any enemy, but if we can reduce the number of our enemies, we can deal with the real enemies. In fact, Andrei Uvarov's words were so out of bounds that even Duke Liu Bei, whom Nicholas I trusted most, did not dare to say such words to his face. Field Marshal Nelka Kinta was even more worried about the young man he admired most. You must know that Nicholas I ascended to the throne on a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. Anyone in Russia who dared to challenge its authority was either in Siberia or dead. At this time, Andrei Uvarov's words were really offensive. The Prime Minister Vasily Levav on the side swallowed his saliva. He did not expect this young man to be so brave. Fortunately, Nicholas I was not angry. He just nodded, but still looked at Vasily Levav with very contemptuous eyes. The latter only dared to smile in a flattering manner. Vasily Levav did not even dare to make any big moves, for fear of making another move that would anger his majesty. That's all Nicholas I thought for a while, and gave the instruction, if possible, the war can be dragged on a little longer. Yes, your majesty. In fact, Andrei Uvarov also wanted to do this, but he did not dare to say these words himself, because the Tsar and the Prussian royal family were related by marriage, and he was really not sure whether the Tsar would be angry with him. The longer the war drags on, the worse it will be for Prussia, because more blood will be shed. The same is true for Sweden and Denmark, but this is definitely good news for Russia. After all, the decline of other countries in the Nordic region will be more beneficial to Russia. Andrei Uvarov knew very well that Russia's expansion direction could only be Northern Europe and the Middle East, because once it went west, the Russian-Austrian alliance would inevitably collapse. Unless the two sides can reach some kind of agreement, that will require Russia to pay a huge price. Nicholas I obviously did not want to pay an excessively high price, which would most likely incur Austria's dissatisfaction. Judging from the relationship between Russia, Prussia, and Austria at this time, once the Russian-Austrian relationship breaks down, the Russo-Prussian alliance will cease to exist. However, as long as the Russo-Austrian alliance exists, the Prussians will not dare to do anything. London, England. John Russell was not happy at all at this time. Prussia's attack on Denmark should have been a good thing for Britain. After all, they do not want Denmark to have a harmonious relationship with the German Confederation. Once Denmark's important geographical location falls into the hands of the German Confederation, it will be even more powerful. The tiger here refers to Denmark. The Danes hate the British very much. If they can rise again, the first person they will have to deal with is the British. The British know this better than anyone else. After all, they burned the Danish fleet and their capital by the way. However, the annihilation of the British Mediterranean fleet was a huge blow to them. Because it was a total annihilation, the British side still doesn't even know the battle loss ratio, and they don't even know whether it was the French who wiped out Edward Collinson. Main force. Now the British government may not necessarily know as much as the newspapers. They only know that the French won the naval battle in the Mediterranean, but the losses on both sides are not clear. It is unclear whether Edward Princeton's fleet was lost or simply disappeared. On the other hand, the Austrians took the opportunity to sneak attack on the island of Crete. At this time, nearly 10,000 British troops were captured and became hostages. The only good news is that France and Austria have taken no further action, and Gibraltar is still safe. In fact, the French wanted to attack Gibraltar, but the Spanish did not cooperate, and France themselves suffered heavy losses in the Mediterranean naval battle. They were unable to take action against a strong coastal defense fortress. Do the Spanish really not want to take back the Strait of Gibraltar? I really don't want to. At this time, the civil strife in Spain was ongoing, and they had no spare power to deal with the British. In fact, there is no need for the British to add insult to injury. Spain itself is falling apart. John Russell was still confused. He didn't know whether the annihilation of the British Mediterranean fleet was a joint conspiracy between France and Austria. If it's not, it's okay. If it is, it will be a big trouble. When the two most powerful countries in the Mediterranean join forces, Britain must respond with all its strength. Moreover, it is unclear what tactics the French used to eliminate an entire fleet. At this time, a hasty attack on the army would most likely make the same mistake as the Spanish Armada. But if you only send a medium-sized fleet, it is tantamount to death. The navy is a gold-eating beast. No matter how powerful Britain's national power is, it cannot withstand such consumption. In addition, the Austrians also had a group of British prisoners, as well as two strategic locations in Crete and Durrës. What's even more unlucky is that it rained all night when the house leaked, and a new round of turmoil began in North America on the other side of the ocean. The Americans once again asked Britain to redraw the dividing line with the Canadian colonies. The Americans were convinced that Britain would be mired in the European battlefield and unable to deal with them, so they dared to make such unreasonable demands. But if the British really don't send troops there, then the Americans really dare to cross the border between the two countries. After all, the latter has done this before. Then Britain also received a personal letter from said the Great of the Oman Empire, after Palmerston proposed to win over the Oman Empire, to disintegrate Austria's power in East Africa. The partner the British found was the Oman Empire. After all, the East African overlords should be very dissatisfied with the Austrians' aggression. But the reply they received was that if Britain dared to attack the Austrian East African colonies, the Oman Empire would defend the safety of its allies to the death. Chapter 893 Franz's conditions. The Oman Empire's tough stance was unexpected by the British, because in their impression the Austrians seemed to have been at odds with the Arabs for hundreds of years. Moreover, according to Indian intelligence, there was a fierce conflict between Austria and the Oman Empire in the Zanzibar region. The most important thing is that from the British point of view, it was Austria that took away Bagamoyo and occupied a large area of the Oman Empire's territory in East Africa. Therefore, the two sides should not be said to be in the same situation, but also superficially inseparable. But said's harsh reply made the British begin to doubt the intelligence work of the Indians. After all, Hassan was not very reliable in their stereotype. However, the attitude of the Oman Empire did disrupt the British deployment. It would not be difficult for the British to deal with Oman and Austria alone, but it would be difficult for the two to come together. At least the British cannot just call a nearby squadron to ensure victory. However, once troops are mobilized from other regions, a vacuum will be formed, which will greatly affect Britain's global dominance. In fact, Britain's diplomacy has been in a passive position since I don't know when. It seems that all countries are targeting Britain. The era when one could stir up troubles with just one word seems to have passed. The cost of diplomatic actions is getting higher and higher. The great powers, even those little known small countries, are beginning to doubt the good intentions of the British Empire. The licking dogs that were willing to act as puppets were gone, replaced by a group of hunters who were either hostile or very vigilant. The British themselves realized this and worked hard to reverse this unfavorable situation, but somehow there always seemed to be an invisible hand pushing them back to the starting point. And as time goes by, the situation continues to worsen. In the past, the British government only had to raise its voice a little and the Gazette government in France would agree to all conditions, even if it required the French to cut out their hearts and lungs. No matter how Britain tried to regulate Austria and weaken its influence, Metternich would always stand firmly on the side of Britain as its most loyal ally. No matter what nonsense the British government said. Nassau was willing to believe it, and did his best to lobby that Tsarist government for Britain. The Netherlands, Portugal and the like had to sell their overseas interests in order to be qualified to lick Britain's toes, while Prussia was not even qualified to be a dog licker. What is Brazil and the Viceroyalty of La Plata? Do Indians dare to rebel? Shouldn't Nanyang be Britain's food basket? But everything changed at this time, and France dared to strike hard at Britain. Even if it was in deep internal crisis, the Austrians even chose to attack Britain amid the outflanking of Italians, Hungarians, Bohemians, Czechs. The concept of the Czech nation had not yet been widely accepted at that time, and German nationalists. The battle with the Austrian navy completely exceeded British expectations. In fact, no one in the British leadership thought that the Austrian navy would rush out of the Adriatic Sea. Not to mention that Britain had already set up checkpoints in Albania. From a strategic perspective alone, the Austrian navy should also support the Venetian battlefield or directly attack the Papal States to steal the Italians' retreat. As for the Russians, their previous poor signal turned into complete indifference. In other words, Britain had lost its influence on Russia at this time. Britain's influence over other small countries was also declining. At this time, Prussia intended to get involved in Schleswig, and their king even announced that Prussia would be annexed to Germany. Although the Germans found it strange to hear William IV's words, the British had their own understanding, and their understanding made them feel that this matter was no small matter. John Russell even had the feeling that everything was in danger, and he felt that this might also be a trap. The other party's goal is the British North Sea Fleet, but who is planning it? Denmark? Is it Sweden? Is it Russia? Or all of them? A nervous and uneasy mood spread among the British senior officials. At this time, the news of the destruction of the Mediterranean fleet was still a piece of gossip that was regarded as an April Fool's Day joke point. If this news is made public, then the cabinet will definitely resign collectively at this time to apologize point, because there has been no precedent for the British main fleet to be completely wiped out in a century. This shameful record is enough to nail them to the pillar of shame point previously in the Turkish-Egyptian war in Southeast Asia. They had created history in which squadrons and mixed fleets were annihilated. Now the entire Mediterranean fleet is missing. Because no silent news from the Mediterranean fleet has been received, the British official tentatively assumes that it was defeated and missing. Palmerston was also very depressed because he had tried his best to drive away tigers and devour wolves. And since when did the Arabs become so trustworthy? Just as the top British officials were confused, the intelligence agency found a message sent a few years ago. Intelligence revealed that a Habsburg archduke was married to an Omani princess. The evil lower body castle. This is the unified thinking in the minds of the British top brass at this time, but it seems to make sense that the Oman Empire acted violently. In fact, Said was frightened when he saw the letter asking him to attack the Austrian colonies. Emperor Said even thought it was a British conspiracy. Not just Said, but everyone in the entire Omani court felt that the British were either crazy or planning to push them into a pit of fire. Others may not know it clearly, but the Oman Empire is only separated from the Austrian East African colonies by a sea. The Omanis feel that no one in the world knows Austria better than they do, and they have personally experienced the power of the Austrian Navy and army. In the eyes of the Omanis, the Austrian army is simply invincible, and there is almost no unified enemy in front of them. Whether it was the powerful Ouijan kingdom, those indigenous kingdoms, or the East Bantu people, they were wiped out almost as soon as they appeared on the scene. There was also the navy that the Oman Empire was once proud of, but the entire army was annihilated, but could not be exchanged for the sinking of an Austrian warship. In addition, Austria's attitude towards its enemies also frightens them. The Austrians rarely take prisoners, and most of the time they deal with them by burying them on the spot or burning them on the spot. In fact, most of the time it was Austria's servants who were responsible for fighting. Those Dalits from India were much more brutal than their masters. That kind of cruelty seemed to come entirely from the malice between the two species. For a relatively primitive dynasty like the Oman Empire, they were completely unable to understand the significance of doing so. Although the British Empire claimed to be the most powerful country in the world at this time, in the eyes of the Omanis, it was an honest person who paid lease fees regularly. The Austrian Empire was a powerful and ferocious conqueror. Naturally, they would not choose to be enemies with such a terrible opponent. In fact, according to the information sent back by Princess Sneaker and the businessmen who went to Austria for business, Austria's power was completely beyond their imagination. The steel behemoth prowls the port, and there are as many soldiers as ants. The grain and steel at the dock can be piled up into hills, and countless workers loading and unloading day and night cannot finish moving them. In particular, the amount of steel shocked the Omanis, because there were not many iron mines in the entire Oman Empire, and the method of producing steel was very primitive. Iron itself was considered a luxury item in the Oman Empire, so I was particularly shocked when I saw the Austrian ironclads and those reinforced concrete buildings. Princess Sneaker even used her special status to visit several Austrian steel plants. She concluded at that time that the steel output of the entire Oman Empire could not match that of an Austrian steel plant. And such a huge steel plant is not ranked at all in the Austrian Empire. Friedrich even said personally that France has 2 special steel plants, and the output of these 2 steel plants is equal to that of other steel plants in the Austrian Empire. Total steel production. In addition, Princess Sneaker also sent back some statistical reports on the industrial data of the Austrian Empire. The figures above were something that Said could not even dream of. However, these so-called confidential information were deliberately leaked by Franz to Princess Sneaker. In fact, this woman was also very smart. She discovered some clues after succeeding several times, but she did not say anything clearly. It was just a casual mention at the banquet that the Ottoman Empire would be Austria's eternal friend, or at least she was trying to do so. Princess Sneaker's strange words made Archduke Friedrich confused, but Franz knew the meaning of these words very well. After all, this kind of intelligence work is very dangerous, and it is very easy to arouse suspicion. Even if she pretends to be stupid and pretends not to know, once she is discovered one day, she may be dismissed by Franz as a dangerous factor. Princess Sneaker is well aware of Franz's energy, while her husband Friedrich is just a fool who likes military affairs. There were too many opportunities and too many reasons for Franz to take action, and Friedrich couldn't protect her at all, and he didn't even know what was happening. And if things become clear one day, then maybe Franz won't do anything at all, and Friedrich will cut her into pieces for long-term considerations. Princess Sneaker decided to show off. She didn't mind being a double agent, and as an Arab woman, when she married in Austria, she was actually considered a member of the Habsburg family or a personal property of Friedrich. Therefore, she felt no guilt at all for betraying her motherland and original family. On the contrary, revealing Austrian intelligence to the Ottoman Empire put her under great pressure, and even made her conscience uneasy. The attitude of the Ottoman Empire declared the British plan in the Western Indian Ocean completely bankrupt. Returning to the European issue at this time, the Austrian side has proposed peace talks, while the attitude of the French provisional government is relatively ambiguous. In fact, the latter has no backbone at all, and there are many internal factions and a mixed bag of good and bad. However, Palmerston's previous plan to support a pro-British government also went bankrupt. On the one hand, it was the disastrous defeat of the British Mediterranean fleet. On the other hand, there was no soil for pro-British factions at this time, when French nationalism was rising. Both France and Austria should be able to accept the British peace agreement, which gives the British room for maneuver. They can fight one by one. The question now shifts to whether to make an armistice with France and continue to deal with Austria, or to make an armistice with Austria and continue to deal with France. France and Austria both have a large number of colonies overseas, and they are relatively wealthy. Both the French Texas colony and the Austrian California colony were areas with great potential. Of course it would be best to win them all, but not now. All this was due to the destruction of the Mediterranean fleet. The French Navy was the main force fighting the British Navy, so it must have suffered heavy losses. Although the Austrian side does not seem to participate in large-scale battles, the Austrian Navy is not worth mentioning. However, the Austrians occupied the large island of Crete and had a geographical advantage. If the Austrians turned the naval battle into a land battle, the British losses would be great. The Lord of the Admiralty was the first to oppose landing operations on the island, because first of all, the Mediterranean is the territory of the Austrians. If the Austrian side does not fight naval battles and focuses on troop transports, then the British Navy's escort fleet will have no way at all. It is impossible for all marines to sit on battleships. After all, these warships do not have that much space to transport soldiers. Secondly, Crete is huge. It would take at least a month to send troops from the British mainland to the Mediterranean island of Crete. Not just sailing time, but also assembly and preparation time. In this month, the Austrians can send at least tens of thousands of troops to the island and enough supplies to supply them for several months or even years. It is simply unrealistic for the Navy to encircle it and force it to surrender. And how many troops are needed to land on the island? 10,000? 20,000? Or 50,000? 100,000? As for attacking Venice, a quarter of the artillery of the entire Austrian Empire is there, and it is easy to enter a narrow area like the Adriatic Sea, but it is difficult to get out. After all, no one can guarantee that the French will not stab someone in the back. In addition, the German Confederation is attacking Schleswig at this time. Could this be another Austrian Empire conspiracy? Now no one in the entire British government dares to bet, because the cost is too high and no one can afford it. But the French are also very difficult to deal with, because it is not clear how the French won and how much they lost. The most important thing is that no one knows whether the French will create another miracle, and if they start a war with France, they must also be wary of another sneak Attack by the Austrians, of course. There is also the safest way, which is to stop losses in time and stop the war with the two countries so that Britain can continue to maintain its position as the world's strongest navy. The loss of the Mediterranean fleet is indeed a big blow to Britain, but it is still within an acceptable range, and Britain has the ability to build another Mediterranean fleet within 1 to 2 years. John Russell looked at the other members of his cabinet. Everyone looked at each other. After all, no one wanted to be nailed to the pillar of shame in history. Then Palmerston suggested, perhaps we could first listen to the Austrians' terms. John Russell felt that it made sense. After all, you had to shop around, and the conditions offered by the Austrians to the British in the Metternich era had always been very generous. Maybe they could get something out of them to save face. Well, that's a good idea, John Russell confirmed Palmerston's ideas, but the conditions on the Austrian side soon surprised the British. Franz's conditions are, first, Austria will release all British prisoners of war, but in exchange all British ships, buildings, and supplies on Crete will be used as war reparations. Second, Britain must return Crete to the Kingdom of Greece. Chapter 894 Peace Agreement. Franz's conditions made the British feel as if they had not yet woken up, otherwise they would never have seen such an outrageous peace agreement. But in fact, this is Austria's peace agreement. As for why the Austrian government allowed such an outrageous peace agreement to appear on the negotiating table, this is of course due to Franz. At this time, the top officials of the Austrian Imperial government were replaced one after another like a horse. Franz can easily grab a lot of scapegoats. He will still not dirty his hands with this extremely provocative peace agreement, and he will also leave a way out for Austria and himself. After all, Franz would still need someone to take the blame if a tough guy from England fell from the sky or there was an accident like a meteorite hitting the ship. In addition to demanding that the British return Crete and confiscate all facilities on the island, Franz also made demands on the number of British troops stationed in Albania. It cannot exceed 3,000, but this is just a cover-up. In fact, Franz hopes that the British will send more people to Albania, preferably hundreds of thousands, so that they can experience what the Balkans are. But the most important thing is the last one, which is what Franz really wants to say, which is to restrict British warships from entering the Adriatic Sea. Vessels weighing more than 1,000 tons and that may threaten the safety of the sea are not allowed to enter. The reason why Franz did this was to tell the British whose territory the Adriatic Sea belonged to. In fact, if there was another way to go, Franz didn't want to do it. But in reality, the Austrian Empire was the leading bird on the European continent, and it was impossible for the British to let it go. No matter how low-key Franz is, no matter how much he avoids provoking the British, no matter how much he finds things for the British to do, they will still keep their eyes on Austria. This is the inevitable fate of overlords and challengers. Since he couldn't escape, Franz had no choice but to face the difficulty. London, England. The gentlemen in white all thought for a long time, and they finally came to a conclusion. That was because the Austrian side was asking for a price, and they were bluffing. After all, it was the French who defeated the British fleet at this time, and they just took the opportunity to seize Crete. But Britain's own front is stretched too long. There are enemies everywhere from Asia to Europe to the Americas, and almost every one of them is a regional hegemon. In the Mediterranean alone, there are France and Austria. Your Majesty Prime Minister. Now the German Confederation is pulling Prussia to fight Schleswig for no apparent reason. I think this is an Austrian conspiracy. They were obviously heading for the Kiel military port. Knowing that they could not break out of the Mediterranean, the Austrians wanted to move to the North Sea so that they could directly attack our homeland. Canning's mind is wide open, and he has always been good at Black Austria. But Lord Admiralty George Eden scoffed at the idea, saying, "The Austrians are just trying to distract us." At this time, John Russell's head was about to explode. There were conflicts everywhere in the world, and everything could cause huge disasters. He, who was already a middle-aged man, couldn't bear it anymore. Then, what do you think we should do, Lord? Admiral George Eden actually just wanted to emphasize his presence, and he had no good solution to the messy situation at this time. John Russell usually refused to listen to others' advice, but this time he was asked by name. George Eden could not refute the other person's face and had to say, the Mediterranean has not been a blessed place for our British Empire, and 2 of our 3 disastrous defeats over the years have occurred in the Mediterranean. Perhaps we shouldn't go too deep, because there are too many interests of the great powers involved here. If France and Austria hadn't joined forces this time, I don't believe that our Mediterranean fleet would have been completely wiped out. George Eden only expressed his guess, but these words made other British senior officials feel nervous like a bolt from the blue. The last thing they wanted to hear was this speculation. Although they had thought about it themselves, there was nothing worse than this. However, this guess is extremely reasonable, because only in this way can we explain why the Austrian side is so arrogant and makes such harsh demands. Then the strategy they had envisioned before, of pulling one to fight one another, may fail again, because it is simply a trap. Withdrawing troops and accepting peace is probably the most beneficial and stable option for Britain at this time, but the question comes back again, who will take the blame? Suddenly everyone looked at the Earl of Auckland, who still owed a day's worth of shit. On the contrary, his name and reputation were already ruined on the street, so let's just leave him alone. John Russell seized the Lord of the Admiralty's hand and shook it violently. Auckland, my friend, you are a genius. I want to support you. When the surrounding cabinet members saw this scene, they didn't know that the Prime Minister had finally found the scapegoat, and everyone stepped forward to congratulate him. Earl of Auckland, we support you. Your advice is so helpful. I think Her Majesty the Queen will definitely approve of your genius suggestion. Merciful Earl of Auckland, I thank you on behalf of those soldiers who should have gone to the battlefield. You are truly a humanitarian. Earl Auckland gradually lost himself in the praises Britain submitted to letters of credence to Austria and Prussia respectively, with completely opposite tone and wording, accusing Prussia of aggression. At the same time, Britain stated that it would send troops to protect Denmark's interests when necessary, and that Prussia would use all means, including military strikes and economic blockades, when necessary. Although the British said it was serious. In fact, they were not prepared to send an army to help Denmark, or even go deep into the Baltic Sea. At this time, the British were not sure whether this was a conspiracy by other countries, so they would only use maritime power in the North Sea to check the Prussians, and if necessary, they could destroy the Danish military port again. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British directly set fire to the Danish capital and the Danish navy, in order to prevent the Danish navy from being used by the French. On the other hand, the British almost accepted all the harsh conditions proposed by France, but they also brought some additional terms. Franz had expected this. After all, would he still be British if he didn't bargain? The British conditions were also very simple. The first was that Austria could not ally with France. Secondly, the island of Crete belongs to the territory of the Ottoman Empire and the UK has no right to transfer it, but its interests in Crete can be transferred. However, this transfer is not free. The Austrian side needs to pay £5 million to redeem these rights. Afterwards, it does not matter whether the Austrian side wants to enjoy them exclusively or transfer them to the Greeks. The UK will not interfere in this matter. Third, Britain will move the Mediterranean fleet to Cyprus, so Austria should be responsible for the navigation safety of British merchant ships in the western Mediterranean. Finally, Austria was not allowed to annex the Papal States. The first 3 items were all used by the British to disgust Austria, and some of them also meant to sow discord. After all, the British like to judge others by themselves, and they feel that Austria, France, and Greece cannot be monolithic. In fact, their ideas are quite accurate, because there is no so-called secret agreement between FAR and Austria. If there was a secret agreement, it was a gentleman's agreement between Franz and Count Chambord. It is impossible for the British to find any substantive evidence of this so-called gentleman's agreement. Even the French naval marshal who knew about it has passed away, so it is even less likely that anyone will know the inside story. As for the Kingdom of Greece, France must be responsible to the end. After all, Greece will be Franz's trump card in his fight for hegemony in the Mediterranean and the Balkans in the future. And if you don't look at the monk's face or the Buddha's face, everyone is a family and France must take care of them. The so-called rights and interests in Crete are just a big hole dug by the British for Austria. Any country around the Mediterranean understands the importance of the large island of Crete, but the cake is not that delicious, just like Jing's Hao during the Three Kingdoms period. Everyone wanted it, but whoever took it would be worried, because it would be jointly targeted by other countries, and even the martial sage Guan Yu could not hold it. However, France is neither Tal Khan nor Sun Quan. He will help the Kingdom of Greece defend it, thus serving as a springboard for Austria to dominate the Mediterranean. The last one, not to annex the Papal States, is the British's killer move, and it is also what they are most worried about. Although the war between Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia does not have much reference value, it can be seen that the so-called Italian army is simply a ragtag group of people. As for the Hungarians and Bohemians, although they assured Palmerston that they were not afraid of the Austrian army, they could not provide any evidence to prove this. The British would not pin their fate on other nations, so Palmerston only planned to watch indifferently. Not annexing the Papal States is the bottom line of the British, and it is also the bottom line of other powers. The reason why the British raised it at this time is to remind other powers that Austria has ambitions for Italy. At this time, if other powers also plan to get involved in Italy or want to take advantage of the situation, then Austria will have another backyard fire. At the same time, this is also a double insurance. Only in this way can they ensure that Austria cannot annex the Papal States. In this way, even if the Austrians won the war, they would not get any substantial benefits. The British did not know that Franz had already connected the monarchs of China and Italy, and that Pius IX himself was already on his way to Venice. However, it would take several days for the news to reach Franz, who was still on his way to Venice. Archduke Franz, someone wants to see you. Franz was a little confused because he didn't like to be disturbed. Neither Bordeaux nor Colonel Monta should be so rash. What surprised him even more was that the convoy was resting in the wild at this time. You must know that Franz's route of action was not notified to others in advance, and who was so powerful to find this place. Franz sat up straight and asked, "Who is it, Colonel?" Monta's expression was a little strange. "Explain, it's a lady." Before Colonel Monta finished speaking, a proud and charming woman walked over. Franz's first impression was that he was very beautiful and aggressive. However, he did not remember that he knew such a woman. There was no such person even in the Royal Women's College and the underground institutions that secretly trained agents. But what Franz cares about most at this time is not the origin of this beauty, but why she can appear here openly. "Why is she here?" Franz blurted out, but his tone was not a question but a rebuke. Colonel Monta immediately realized that something was wrong. He knew that Franz would not be unintentional, and knew that his behavior was inappropriate at this time, and immediately wanted to explain. But before Colonel Monta could speak, the woman spoke first. "I've been searched. I'm not an assassin." As she spoke, she took off her suspenders and strutted into Franz's carriage. Then she took off her clothes one by one, completely ignoring the katana around her neck and the muzzle on her temple. "Did you see it clearly? Do you want to search it again? Let them do it, or do you do it yourself?" The woman's provocative words and eyes were still fierce, and Franz was a little helpless. He had no choice but to signal Colonel Monta to close the car door. Franz didn't answer the woman's boring questions. He didn't like being led around by the other party, so he chose the 3 questions of the soul. "Who are you? Where do you come from? What do you want to do? Who am I? Where do I come from? Does it matter?" the woman asked back. She was using her natural advantage to try to turn against the guests, but Franz was not the kind of adventurer who liked excitement. He had more important things to do. Fortunately, this woman of unknown origin has a strong ability to observe people's emotions, and she immediately changed her tactics when she saw Franz. "I can help you, and I think that's the most important thing." "Oh, what can you do? What do you want to do?" "I can meet your every need." The woman started up her routine again, but Franz interrupted her performance. "That's enough. Give you 30 seconds to explain the matter clearly. If you can't explain it clearly," Franz looked at the new guard holding a sword. "Miss Zuosh, please chop off her head." This Miss Sachi was actually one of the foreign students selected by Kagura from the tributes sent by the shogunate nobles. Franz brought her with him, not because of her special abilities, it's just that Franz simply thought that her image and personality were a bit like the heroine in an anime. As for the knife, it was actually a reverse blade knife. The reason why Franz asked her to use the knife was to test her character and ability, but in fact it was more for safety reasons after all. Franz had no intention of playing with fire and burning himself. I am Lola Mons, the witch you call a disaster for the country. Are you satisfied? Franz was indeed a little surprised when he heard the name Laura Mons, but he still said, 10 seconds left. I can find you. That's my ability. I can recommend myself as your pillow, and I can also be your eyes in the dark. Believe me, I have the ability. I will definitely make you unable to live without me. Laura Mons's voice broke slightly after she shouted, but Franz still looked at her coldly and said only one word. Chapter 895. Get out. Roll. The witch who brought disaster to the country. Laura Mons. The only person in the whole of Germany with a worse reputation than her is our Prince Metternich. Ludwig I was indeed not a good king, but Laura Mons was not a good person either. Her extravagance and waste were also one of the black hands that pushed Bavaria's finances into collapse. What can a woman buy that will make a country financially unable to support it? There must be some who feel that Franz's impression is too stereotypical. But what if this woman likes to create spectacles? Build the Emperor's Avenue, renovate the Munich Palace, collect cultural relics from ancient Rome and ancient Greece from all over Europe, and build a luxury villa modeled on the Palace of Versailles in Paris. Ludwig I was originally a romantic and show-off king. Laura Mons and a group of traitorous officials in Bavaria completely hollowed out this already poor country. But Laura Mons was obviously smarter than her partners. At least she was not burned by the angry people of Bavaria, or hung from a tree. In 1848, Bavarian Minister of the Interior Berks and Chief of the Interior Hunter Berg and other officials were liquidated. People rushed into their estates, looted their property, and burned these people and their homes together. Although Laura Mons escaped, her belongings were also lost. At this point, Laura Mons was just looking for a new meal ticket that she could live with. And Franz, the Crown Prince of Austria, a saint in the church's mouth and a good man in the hearts of refugees, naturally came into her sight. First of all, there are many rumors about Franz's former squire. It seems that he was an exiled nobleman from France who once worked as a dancing girl. This is very similar to the experience of Laura Mons. After all, she was a dancer from Paris. Secondly, there are many true and false rumors about Franz. Some people say that he was born knowing everything and could learn everything without a teacher. He could even teach professors as a child and answer questions in the scriptures for bishops. Confused. However, some people say that Franz actually suffered from a serious mental illness and was an uneducated bastard. Those professors were threatened and had to say so, otherwise they would not be able to stay in Vienna. As for the so-called achievements of leading expeditions, everyone in the aristocratic circle knows what is going on, and it is just gilding. However, Bavaria, where Laura Mons is located, is Mrs. Sophie's natal family. As her elder brother, Ludwig I naturally knew some things that outsiders did not know. And this kind of half-truth and half-false rumors are most likely to attract people like Laura Mons, and she doesn't mind taking a gamble. In the end, no matter how you look at it, Franz seems to be a kind man, which can minimize the danger, but Franz doesn't want this fly. Not to mention her ambition. Fame alone will put Franz in a disadvantageous situation. Secondly, Laura Mons' so-called ability is not worth mentioning in Franz's opinion. It is not easy to guess Franz's movements from the national level, but it is not difficult to just follow him. Even if you only stay at a few key points, you still have a high chance of encountering Franz's convoy. The most important thing is that as Franz's strength continues to grow, the era of relying solely on individuals to control intelligence has passed. At this time, there are 4 intelligence agencies in his hands that are not under each other's control. This kind of workload cannot be completed by one person. Moreover, the day is approaching for Franz to come to the stage. He must keep clean and forget about such things that damage his reputation. Therefore, Laura Mons's value to Franz is negative, and telling her to get out is considered polite. Franz can capture him and interrogate him strictly, and maybe he will get some unexpected surprises, such as some palace secrets or hidden gold. cultural relics, etc. Point then it can be sent to Munich and handed over to the nationalists so that Franz can earn another favor. However, considering Franz's relationship with the Wittelsbach family and his personal position, doing so may cause some unnecessary trouble. So out of sight is out of mind. Point Laura Mons was a little stunned, but she didn't say any cruel words such as "I will come back" or "you will regret it," and just left the motorcade in despair. Archduke Franz, she knows your location. Doesn't it need to be dealt with, ma? Artiles asked politely. No need. The Venetia region has been basically pacified at this time, and with the size of our team, it will be useless, even if she brings all the rebels in Venetia. In fact, Franz hoped that Laura Mons would spread his news to the rebels, so that he could save some energy. Point however, Laura Mons did not have the courage. She left Austria as quickly as possible, and then she was going to try her luck in the Netherlands. Of course, flies will not bite seamless eggs. The scandal that William II relied on his mistress to govern the country has long spread throughout the European aristocratic circles. Laura Mons felt that she still had a chance. One day later, Venice. Before Franz entered the city, someone sent a message. The Pope has come down. This news caused a burst of exclamation in the team. The Austrian officers and soldiers looked at each other. They couldn't believe their ears and were a little at a loss. In fact, most of them are Catholics, so they still have some respect for the Pope. It's okay to let them fight the troops of the Papal State, but if they really fight the Pope, they are still afraid of going to hell. Franz was not surprised. After hearing that the Pope had handed over all his power, he knew that this day would come to Piersike's point. When Franz heard that the Pope had sent all his followers to the battlefield, he knew that this day was not far away. Both Bordeaux and Mont looked at Franz. Although they were also Franz's cronies, they did not know about this, so they both looked at Franz with questioning eyes. Now that the Pope has crowned himself, we naturally have to entertain him well. Venice City, Town Hall. Franz finally met Pius IX himself. Although the latter wore a gold-rimmed robe and held a scepter that had been passed down for thousands of years, he still could not hide his haggardness and decline. "Hello, Your Majesty the Pope. Please forgive me for the long absence." Franz knelt down on one knee very respectfully. This was the highest courtesy a royal family could give, and only the Pope could bear it. This made Pius IX a little surprised, but what followed was a surprise. To be honest, he has been the Pope for so long, and no one with real status has ever treated him with such courtesy. However, at this time, Pius IX was no longer the political novice who released all political prisoners without thinking. When he was in Rome. Then the Pope felt a rare moment of fear, and he quickly leaned down to help Franz up. "Child, I think you should know that our faith and my holy city are in danger." Certainly. Chapter 896. The Master of Justice. 20. The conversation between Franz and Pius IX confused everyone around him. Shouldn't these two be mortal enemies? Shouldn't we hope that the other party will surrender? Why are you singing along here? And why did the crisis in the city of Rome become Austria's crisis again? His Majesty the Pope, I have always believed in God and your virtue. Someone must have falsely conveyed your will and tried to shake our faith in God. Franz's words made everyone even more confused. Pius IX publicly declared war in the Vatican. How could this be false? At this time Pius IX said, "Child, that is the devil's conspiracy. Now they have occupied the holy city, and even the soldiers on the front line have been bewitched by them." In these words, Pius IX inadvertently revealed several pieces of information. That is, he not only lost Rome, but also lost the command of the army. Franz was a little speechless. To be honest, he didn't expect that Pius IX would even lose his military power. But even if Pius IX had an army, he would still come here to find him. If he had no food or money, Your Holiness, please rest assured that we, the Habsburg family and Austria, have always been the most devout believers. But I need you to issue an edict and let us help you return to the holy city. No problem, kid. I'm ready. Pius Ninth took out a parchment scroll and handed it to Franz in a dignified manner. April 21st, 1848. Pope Pius IX officially declared that the Roman government was a follower of the devil and that he would support Austria's just war against evil. At the same time, the Pope also issued a letter to the people of Apennines, the content of which is to warn people not to associate with the devil. As for who is the devil? Of course it is Austria's enemies, ultranationalists, liberals, capitalists who want independence, and nobles who take advantage of the opportunity to cause trouble are all on the blacklist. Pius IX issued the largest fine in Catholic history. More than 70,000 people were excommunicated, and the whole world was in an uproar. Excommunication, translated from the Latin excommunicatio, originally meant to cut off communication, a punishment imposed by the Holy See on clergy and believers, namely excommunication. According to Catholic theology, those who are excommunicated cannot ascend to heaven after death. So the crusaders who were participating in the Holy War before suddenly became followers of the devil. The faith of the Italian coalition almost collapsed, and deserters began to appear in large numbers. In more extreme cases, soldiers even assassinated officers and nobles on the excommunication list. News that the army was out of food and supplies had been cut off spread simultaneously. Lapor saw hostile eyes everywhere, and neither whips nor pistols could give him a sense of security. However, the shopkeeper also became ruthless. He ordered the execution of all soldiers who discussed excommunication. A full curfew was implemented in the military camp. Any soldier who escaped or attempted to escape would be sentenced to death. Lapor's series of actions have further confirmed his identity as a believer of the devil. Some people even think that Lapor is the incarnation of the devil. In fact, as long as Franz thought about it, the news would spread very quickly. The whole Apennine region knew these things almost overnight. King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies had been planning for a long time. He was waiting for this opportunity, so he took the lead in attacking. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies began a sweeping sweep of liberals and revolutionaries, while also overturning previously established laws and policies. As for the so-called supporters, most of them have been sent to the battlefield by Ferdinand II under various names. The rest either surrendered or rebelled, and only a handful of people still chose to resist. Ferdinand II had been fooled twice by the liberals, and he did not want to hold back now. Therefore, his order was that he would rather kill by mistake than let go. The bloody massacre also earned him the reputation of the cannonball king, but at this time Ferdinand II no longer cared. He only cared about his throne and power. Besides, isn't there still the Edict of Pius IX? Just put all the blame on religion and the Pope, and maybe they can rob the church again. In addition to the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, other states in Italy also took action. They had long since refused to support this costly war, so they almost always announced the return of their monarch as soon as possible. Those nobles who wanted to unite the capitalists before, after seeing the so-called free government, they found that monarchy was better. After all, the monarchs still rely on them, and the capitalists just want to kill them. The people at the bottom also do not support the so-called new government, because their lives and status have not been improved, but have become more difficult. Because of the lifting of the price limit order in the past, they could at least survive working for the landlords, but liberal capitalists have no feudal obligations. The latter will only drive the poor out of their houses by any means, and then squeeze out the last drop of their value. Moreover, the Pope has said that those people are followers of the devil, so after the devil dies, doesn't he not have to pay back the debt he owes? As a result, the burning method, which had been lost for hundreds of years, has once again appeared on the stage of history. As for the regional rebellions that were originally part of Austria in the past, the rebellion was even more intense. These people experienced a fall from a paradise with enough food to a world without enough food, and then fell to a hell without food. The huge contrast made these people the staunchest opponents of the devil. They took advantage of the complex terrain in the mountains of central Italy to start hunting down the devil's believers. The people in the area where the Italian allied forces are located are convinced that the Italian allied forces are bewitched by the devil because they feel the pain. The so-called Italian coalition forces lacked food and clothing, and their military discipline was ruined. They would naturally disturb the local people, and the conflict between the two sides would naturally be the most intense point for a time. The liberals in various countries in Italy fell one after another, and the monarchs were restored one after another. The Austrian officers and soldiers went through the inner journey of excitement, confusion, and sudden enlightenment within a few days anyway. Now they are partners in justice, and the church and God are on their side. This solves the worries of most people. After all, many people are still afraid of going to hell after death, so they do not work in the war. But now I'm fighting the devil's believers instead, which in the past was as high as going to heaven after death. So the Austrian army launched a full-scale counterattack. Labor tore up the notice of punishment to pieces. In fact, he was afraid that others would see it and only punish the culprit, so he never asked this question. At this time, Lapor's position was unable to advance or retreat. The Austrian army in front was guarding the valley, and no matter how many people he sent, he could not break through. Want to go back? Where to go back? Neither Roman liberals nor papal conservatives recognized him. Even at the end of the road, Lapor still didn't want to surrender. He liked the feeling of having great power. Even if he was to die tomorrow, he would die as a marshal instead of living as a small shopkeeper for the rest of his life. Labor decided that, even if he was going to die, he would drag everyone with him to support him. But then he thought that he was going to die anyway if he did something he had never done before dying. Lapor looked at the handsome messenger. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 897. Two major problems. The word Bohemia once had nothing to do with wealth. But after the Austrian Empire lost wealthy Silesia, Empresses turned the empire's economic focus to Bohemia. What followed was the infusion of a large amount of capital and handicrafts. Glass manufacturing, steel plants, and various shops sprung up all over Bohemia. But that only transformed it from a village into a city. With the advent of the industrial age, Bohemia's status was once again elevated. However, historically, major development would not occur until after 1850. However, Franz advanced the progress at this time. After joining the German customs union, Bohemia's economy took off directly. Coupled with Franz's investment and planning, it became one of the fastest growing economic regions in Europe. Driven by huge interests, German businessmen and local nobles and officials jointly revived Czech nationalism. But the difference in history is that Franz found an opponent for them, German nationalists. Under the guidance of the either thinking of both sides, neither Czech nationalism nor German nationalism had any influence in Bohemia. Dominate. The Czech nationalists are even at a disadvantage, so although they covet the special status of the Magyar people, from a practical perspective, the conditions for a national uprising are not ripe for them. Czech nationalist leader Palacký even warned that blind recklessness will destroy everything we have created so far. At this time, Palacký was more like Zichenyi than Kossuth, so his hints were very tactful and not sharp. But it turns out that rational individuals often cannot stop violent collectives. The fierce confrontation between Czech nationalists and German nationalists gave birth to something newer and more powerful. Pan-Slavism, as the so-called Czech nationalists found it impossible to defeat the German nationalists with their strength, who were too numerous. Although there were not many Germans in Austria, they continued to draw reinforcement from the German Confederation. Then a magical idea flashed in their minds. Bohemia was indeed not strong enough to compete with the entire German nation. But Slavic people are not only Czechs, but also Slovaks, Ukrainians, Transylvanians, Slovenians, Croatians, Serbs, Poles, and Russians. What if we could ask for help from these fellow Slavs? Going further, can these hundreds of millions of people be united to form a super confederation? Such a super confederation spanning the Eurasian continent will be able to defeat the enemies of all Slavic nations, and any other nation will be trampled under their feet. And in reality, there is an excellent example of Russia, but what is sad is that even the Russians do not support them. It is true that Nicholas I, who promoted Great Slavism, was opposed to the so-called Pan-Slavism of the Czechs. although the two have many similarities. For example, both wanted to make Constantinople the capital, and both wanted to make the Ottomans and the Hungarians were driven out of Eastern Europe. But the Czechs wanted a confederation, not an empire or a federation. This was simply unacceptable to the Tsar. He did not want to share power with others and then swear an oath to a constitution promulgated by others. However, the promises from Britain and Hungary and the Holy War launched by the Pope gave the Bohemians unrealistic dreams. Note, the Moravians, who are also Czechs, are opposed to Czech nationalism, at least in terms of actual actions. Palmerston assured Palacky that the British Navy would blockade the Austrian coastline and would provide strong support to the Czech nationalists through secret passages. Palacky was also a professor, but his eloquence was still somewhat inferior to Palmerston's. Palmerston's words made Palacky feel that the gentlemen in front of him would definitely help the Czechs regain their standing among the European nations. He had also had a long talk with Kossuth before, who was also a passionate speaker, and a meal of chicken blood also made Palacky feel that he was omnipotent. He believed that the Hungarians would be able to defeat the decadent Austrian army, which would greatly ease the pressure on Bohemia. By then, maybe the rebels in Bohemia can march straight into Vienna, which would be a historic moment. Of course, Kossuth also saw this idea of Palacky. The former praised the latter's ambition and said a lot of words that made Palacky very useful. Pope Pius IX's messenger also gave him great encouragement. After all, priests have the same professional counterparts in this field. Palacky was deeply moved by the support from all parties. He felt that he had no reason to continue to shirk and let his compatriots down, so he decided to come out. As for the college students at Czech universities, they naturally hope that teachers can join them. Nobles, businessmen, and bureaucrats are also very welcome. After all, it is a good thing not to have to stand up for them. With Palacky's participation, the Czech nationalist organization finally embarked on the path of formalization. However, Palacky is still very particular about himself. He wants to be polite before fighting. Palacky made a petition and imitated the Hungarians' 12-point program, and the Czechs also made a 7-point agreement. Generally speaking, they are relatively restrained and do not want to establish an independent country like the Hungarians and annex some Austrian lands, but they asked for the same privileges as the Hungarians before them. Although they did not ask for political independence, they asked for economic and military independence. In addition, Czech must be included as an official language. Czech must have the same status as German in schools, and Czech should be the main language below universities. Any policy requires the approval of the Czech parliament before it can be implemented, and the Czech army will not participate in Austria's foreign operations. The Austrian government will naturally not agree to such an outrageous initiative. In fact, no matter how weak a government is, they will not agree to directly transfer their power. What's more, at this time, the Vienna government was only in chaos on the surface. In fact, major decisions were made by Franz and Mrs. Sophie. However, the negotiation with Hungary was not the case. It was simply a wrong decision made by two political newcomers under pressure from the domestic privileged class. On April 6, 1848, the Bohemian Equality Committee led by Palacky officially declared an uprising on the grounds that the emperor refused to reform. The vanguard of the uprising was naturally the students of the University of Prague. These passionate young people were usually hostile to the German faction, so they were naturally at the forefront. Those small shopkeepers, small businessmen, and small nobles were the backbone of the uprising. They had large numbers, good weapons, and professional skills overall. However, the Czech nationalists were still at an absolute numerical disadvantage, but the uprising still occurred. This actually has something to do with Prince Windisch-Gratz, the top commander of the local garrison. He is not a Czech nationalist, but he is by no means a German nationalist. Prince Windisch-Gratz is a typical aristocratic bureaucrat. He still adheres to Metternich's theory of national checks and balances, which is to make domestic nationalities hostile to each other, so that the Austrian government can profit from it. Therefore, Prince Windisch-Gratz, who had a large number of troops, actually chose to sit back and watch the uprising occur when he determined that the target of the Czech attack was the Germans and Jews in the city. Most of the Germans here were not Austrians, but came from other German confederations to settle and do business in Bohemia. As for the Jews, let alone them, In the eyes of Prince Windisch-Gratz, dealing with them was simply an act of justice. The battle between the two sides seemed to Prince Windisch-Gratz to be a dog-eat-dog battle. His idea was very simple, that is, let them fight, and then go out to clean up the mess after the group of people tired themselves out. This can not only save the consumption of troops, but also find a good reason to beat up those so-called nationalists. In addition, Prince Windisch-Gratz also had his own selfish motives. As one of the top nobles of the Austrian Empire, he was naturally closely related to the privileged class who were regulated by France for the sake of himself and his family. Prince Windisch-Gratz felt that he should strengthen the power in his hands, at least not like those guys in Vienna, who were eventually beaten to death by a group of rogues under the royal orders. The Bavarians were very poor, so in the eyes of the great German aristocrats they were just a bunch of hooligans. But this time Prince Windisch-Gratz's idea cannot be said to be completely wrong, because it is really difficult for Franz to deal with those privileged classes himself before he ascends the throne. So it can only be borrowed from others, and in the chaotic Vienna, there is nothing more suitable than a group of strangers. Prince Windisch-Gratz wants to support the bandits in order to respect themselves. But the German nationalists are not so easy to deal with. This group of people often clashes with Czech nationalists, so they also have weapons and equipment. The so-called powerful support provided by the British was nothing more than hundreds of outdated muskets. In fact, Palmerston also had difficulties, because at this time there were uprisings everywhere in Germany, and the censorship at every level was much stronger than before. But the most important thing was that the people in charge had changed, and all the previous channels and methods it's not easy to use. In addition, Prince Windisch-Gratz is not a fool, so he cannot let the situation develop to the point where he cannot handle it. If the situation in Bohemia really gets out of control, then he may not be able to protect himself, let alone raising the bandits. However, the reality is that the influence of the rebellion in Bohemia is far greater than Prince Windisch-Gratz expected. Vienna has been under tremendous pressure, and the whole of Austria is trembling. At the same time, the Hungarian army, led by Borjani, deceived the gate of a fortress outside Pressburg, and all 1,500 defenders were massacred. You must know that Pressburg is less than 60 kilometers away from Vienna, which means that the Hungarian army can reach Vienna in just 2 days. Although the senior officials in Vienna were shocked, they were not panicked, because Pressburg had not fallen, and there were nearly 100,000 garrison troops around, while Borjani only had a few thousand cavalry. It was impossible for them to break into Vienna. But the nobles of Vienna could not sit still. A large number of members of the noble senate were gathering in a manor on the outskirts of Vienna. The families of these people have a history of hundreds of years, and the 4 oldest families can even be traced back to before the arrival of the Habsburg family. They were already one of the most powerful families in Vienna. We cannot be buried with the Habsburg fools. That's right. Look at the stupid things they did. Let a fool become the emperor. This country will be destroyed in their hands. This damn Vienna government, they don't know who to serve. We are the masters of this country. A group of people were attacking the Habsburgs and the Austrian government over the situation in Vienna. However, some people have raised objections. I think Archduke Franz is pretty good, and the church bishops speak highly of him. As long as we survive this period, I think we still have hope. Have you bought the shares of Royal Development Company? Even though the market is so miserable this year, the dividends are still over a dozen points. Indeed, if I had known earlier, I would have bought more. This would be more profitable than any other business. Exactly. If the Habsburg family falls, this Royal Development Company will also be gone, and my fortune and life will be on it. At this time, an old man stood up and tapped the ground hard with his cane. Don't you have any honor as a noble? You talk about money all day long. We are nobles. We want to live with dignity. What are the Habsburgs and the Austrian government doing now? They have no ability to protect us. The Hungarians have already arrived. The troops of the Papal States are coming soon. Now even the Bohemians are in rebellion. I think this Austrian ship will sink sooner or later. What do you mean? Duke Fontero, you have to understand that this is Vienna. Naturally, there are many supporters of Austria among the great nobles. They like to say bad things about the Austrian government and the Habsburg family behind their backs, but they do not want to overthrow its rule. In fact, due to the existence of the Royal Development Company, Franz invited these people to buy shares many times and even gave them private placements in order to win over these people. Therefore, many big nobles are already shareholders of the Habsburg family. It is not easy for them to get off the ship. Naturally, they cannot sit still when they hear that someone is about to sink the ship. Although Franz was almost ready to move these nobles into the Royal Development Company, some people still did not buy Franz's account. It's nothing, they just simply feel that they cannot let the royal family succeed. Franz didn't have any good way to deal with these people, but as long as they didn't rebel, Franz wouldn't touch them and would even give them a chance to get on the bus. But under the current crisis, some of the great nobles had other ideas. Duke Fantero said in a tone of educating children. Duke Ryan, you are still young, don't be so impulsive. Take a look at the conditions proposed by the Hungarians first, and it is not too late for you to object. The Ryan family and the Fantero family have been married for generations. The relationship between the two families is very close, and the latter is the elder of the former, so he can't say anything. The Count of Savoy on the side snorted coldly. Duke Fantero, didn't you just buy the shares of the Royal Development Company? Even with your millions, you want to be a shareholder, so stop dreaming. Do you have a role to speak here? Duke Fantero roared and pointed to the box beside him. Hungarians are very willing to spend money, and our status will be higher than lower. Chapter 898 repeat. In fact, this is not the first time Duke Ryan has heard such words. The Hungarians even found him directly before. But to be honest, he doesn't like the Hungarian money. As Count Savoy said before, the shares of the Austrian Royal Overseas Development Company are too valuable. As long as they accepted Franz's royal invitation early, or followed up within the first 2 years, their investment would have at least doubled or tripled over the years. It has only been less than 6 years since the reorganization in 1842, and the actual annual rate of return is close to 50%. Even for those latecomers, doubling their assets is not a problem. This is an extremely exaggerated number, exaggerated enough to make anyone jealous. The Fantero family, which once had millions in cash flow, was also one of the top wealthy families in the Austrian Empire. Apart from the royal family and Archduke Karol, there were only a handful of families that could spend millions of florins at a time. You must know that Franz could only receive a gift of hundreds of thousands of florins on his birthday, and millions of florins are an astronomical figure for ordinary people. It may take tens of thousands of years to accumulate without eating or drinking. Franz paid a lot of sincerity to win over these people, but his efforts did not mean there would be rewards, and he might even be looked down upon by the other party. One party is flocking to it, while the other party is scornful. Naturally, the two sides are not talking about the same thing. Duke Fantero, are you sure that you are not inviting a wolf into the house? When the Hungarians attack the city, will they still fulfill their promise? I'm afraid that by then, you will have to vomit out what you have eaten. Duke Ryan's words were very naked, but the words of the Earl of Savoy were even more pungent. It's okay if you can spit it out, but I'm afraid the old man won't be able to breathe, or the Hungarians can't wait and want to dissect him alive. Then the gain outweighs the loss. HMPH. Short-sighted. You're stuck in your ways. You will regret today's decision. Duke Fantero snorted coldly at first, and then reprimanded loudly. However, more than half of the more than 100 people in the room gradually sided with Duke Ryan, and even a branch of the Fantero family also stood over. This was completely beyond Duke Fantero's expectations. At least he felt that his popularity should not be so bad. However, the reality is that after so many years of exposure, there are still only a few people who are truly determined not to touch the railways or the Royal Overseas Development Company. Franz successfully pulled most of the people onto his pirate ship. Duke Fantero originally wanted to take the opportunity to get angry, but the reality was that he really didn't dare to do anything to so many people. The people here are all big nobles with good reputations and backgrounds. It is not a problem for anyone to get hundreds or even thousands of private soldiers if Fantero really takes care of all these people. Even if the Hungarians enter the city, they will not be able to protect him. In desperation, Duke Fantero could only practice take again, but these people were very determined and would not easily change their views due to the instigation of others. Usually they like to denounce the Habsburg royal family because they think it is beneficial to them, but at this time joining forces with the Hungarians to betray Austria is a bit too shocking. It would be okay if this matter was not brought up. Once it was brought up, some smart people thought that there might be royal spies among them. So if they didn't act more intensely, would they be considered a loser? As a result, a group of people more radical than Duke Ryan and Earl of Savoy appeared, and they seemed completely incompatible with Fantero. It stands to reason that these top nobles will not look up or down, and even if they really have deep hatred, they will not show it. The situation in front of him made Duke Fantero confused for a while, but he knew that there was no turning back. He was already determined to join forces with the Hungarians to rebel against Austria in front of so many people. Seeing so many people opposed, he certainly couldn't let his supporters continue to argue with these guys, because the argument becomes clearer and clearer. The more people you speak to, the more hesitant you will be. In addition to being persuaded by the other party, you may also quit due to fear. Although Duke Fantero has a list of these people, according to past experience, the Habsburg family may not even pursue him as the culprit. At this time, Duke Fantero actually did not have much binding force on his allies, so he could only reduce the contact between the two parties. In fact, there is another thing that he is unwilling to admit. That is, there is no benefit at all in angering those great nobles who are unwilling to follow him. Although some people's attitudes may seem tough, most of those people will just sit on the sidelines in the end, unless one party can persuade them by offering more favorable terms. The unhappy separation between the two parties made some people breathe a sigh of relief. After all, they knew very well that every move here was under the surveillance of others. Only the most reckless, stupid and crazy people would foolishly agree to Duke Fantero. If everyone here is really happy and hit it off, then a group of professionally trained revolutionaries will come in and kill the people here. Clean and tidy. Madame Sophie was not Franz, and she did not want to give people a chance, especially when it might threaten her family. Mrs. Sophie didn't want to think about the consequences. She only knew that the dead could not be revenged. Count Zassel's men have been lurking in Duke Fantero's mansion for many years. At this time, a large number of nitroglycerine bombs were hidden in the basement of Fantero Manor. As long as these people decide to join forces to cause trouble, they will be bombed to the sky, including those who are inside, as there have always been many conflicts between Madame Sophie and these great nobles. Madame Sophie is regarded as an outsider by these great nobles, and Madame Sophie cannot accept that these so-called great nobles are dictating behind their backs all day long. In addition, they were going to rebel against the Austrian Empire at this time. If Franz hadn't stopped them, Mrs. Sophie's plan A would have been implemented long ago. Sooner or later, the overly large privileged class in the country will be the target of Franz's rectification. However, considering the actual situation, Franz decided to deal with those disloyal guys first. In Venice, Franz's evaluation of the Bohemian uprising was too petty. In fact, it is not correct to call it the Bohemian uprising. To be precise, it should be the Prague uprising, because people in other parts of Bohemia are still living their normal lives. Historically, the scale of this uprising was also very limited. There were only a few hundred rebels at first. It was impossible for such a small scale to occupy the entire city, but Prince Windishgratz handled it very poorly. He did not rush to suppress it, but chose to let it develop. It was not until the disaster was imminent that he began to suppress it crazily and bloodily. The result is what Czech history says. The Czech nationalists began in 1848. Prince Windishgratz's brutal methods actually had the opposite effect, because he slaughtered more civilians. Most of those who actually participated in the rebellion were not liquidated, and many of them were even released soon after because Prince Windishgratz wanted to show her benevolent side. As a result, the Czechs saw the incompetence and weakness of the Austrian Imperial government, and the burning of Prague and the massacre of innocent people became a scar that this country can never heal. Therefore, Franz could not agree with the title of Prince Windisch-Gratz, the triad of men who saved the Austrian Empire. It would be enough to call him the executioner of Prague or the real father of Czech nationalism. Point in the history of the Prague uprising, this man, who had a lot of troops in his hands, tolerated and supported the traitor, only to discover the problem when the fire burned on his own head. Point the wife of Prince Windisch-Gratz's very mother. She hopes to persuade the businessmen to give more jobs to young people, and also hopes that Bohemians and Germans can coexist peacefully. Point as a result, this woman who hoped for peace ignited the beacon fire in Prague. She was hit in the head by a stray bullet and died on the spot while going out to give alms. After that, there was a drama of anger for the crown, and Prince Windisch-Gratz led the army to flatten Prague to avenge his wife. Point this looks like a very bloody Western revenge drama, but this dead Madonna is not only the wife of Prince Windisch-Gratz, but also the sister of Prince Felix Schwarzenberg. Point Hannah Schwarzenberg was the most beloved child of the Schwarzenberg family. Her unexpected death directly led to a rupture between the two families. Although Prince Windisch-Gratz was known as one of the three principals who saved the Austrian Empire at the time, her brother-in-law Prince Felix Schwarzenberg soon found an opportunity to deprive her of her rights later. Although Prince Windisch-Gratz was a member of the noble senate, he did not have any real power in his hands. During the period of Prime Minister Felix's administration, the Windisch-Gratz family was severely suppressed. Point this directly led to the downfall of the Windisch-Gratz family. Point Franz doesn't like fishing and law enforcement too much, but for the long-term stability of the country, this opportunity to eradicate the disease cannot be missed. Point he felt that the scale of the Prague uprising was too small in history and the problems of dealing with the aftermath were too big. So Franz decided to help them come to the next largest group, the British, the Hungarians, and the Jesuits of Bearsykes. Point coupled with the German nationalists, Franz wanted to make them explode completely and then catch them all. Point however, judging from the current battle reports, the so-called Czech nationalism is still in danger because the German nationalists on the side are too strong. Point moreover, before Prince Windisch-Gratz carried out the massacre, there were not many people in the Czech Republic who really wanted to oppose Austria. Point so, even after fermenting for a long time, they still only had a few thousand people. Point asked Tanner Umholt, France's most capable mercenary leader, Archduke. France, what should I do? There is nothing to say, just kill them all. I will ask Archduke Karol to write a letter ordering Prince Windisch-Gratz not to interfere with your work, Prince. Windisch-Gratz would definitely not listen to this order. Even an order issued by Archduke Karol himself would not allow the regular army to cooperate with the mercenaries. In fact, Franz wanted to deliberately humiliate him and force him to solve the problem in Prague. Otherwise Franz would have no choice but to solve him. Point as for the Hungarians on the other side, Franz didn't think it would be a big problem. Point only one outer fortress was lost, and the Hungarian cavalry also suffered heavy losses and no longer had the ability to advance further. In fact, even the outermost fortress should not be lost. When the Hungarian cavalry led by Borjani attacked Putra Fort, it was no different than death. Point in fact, it was a very stupid decision for the cavalry to raid the fortress. Not to mention the fortress, even the high wooden fence was a huge obstacle to the cavalry. Point the battlefield that the cavalry is really suitable for is only open and solid ground, and at the same time, the infantry cannot be formed into a square formation, so that the cavalry can play its greatest role. Point Franz had the most elite cavalry in the Austrian Empire, but even they could not attack the city on horseback. Point the cavalry led by Borjani was only half of what Kossuth promised him, but the number was the same. They forced an attack on a strong fortress without heavy firepower and naturally ended up in a complete defeat. Point after the Hungarians lost hundreds of cavalry, the defenders in the fortress still suffered zero casualties. The Austrian soldiers in the fortress felt that they could hold it, even if the Hungarians were 10 times more numerous. The soldiers laughed at the Hungarian tactics while shooting at the Crenlatians. They're probably a little bit more of a threat than rabbits. One soldier laughed, and the other soldiers immediately followed. Indeed, I think they might be trying to drain our bullets. Another soldier quipped, so cunning. Of course, as long as they keep attacking like this, we will be out of bullets in a year or two. At this time, an officer came over and stopped his men. Nonsense. Yes, sir. Our gunpowder expired before we ran out of bullets. Ha. Ha ha ha. The Hungarian hussars outside the city looked miserable. They were full of blood, but ran into the tall city wall one after another. The Austrian soldiers, who had no sense of honor, did not dare to go out of the fortress to fight with them. They only dared to huddle in the city and hide behind the shooting ports, to fire cold shots. However, this kind of tactics with neither honor nor technical content was beyond the capabilities of the noble Hungarian hussars. Baogeny looked at the depressed soldiers, and he knew that there would be no results if he continued like this. But Hungary's great cause must be completed, and Mr. Kossuth's ideals must be realized. For this reason, Baogeny decided to do something that he was disgusted with. Baogeny walked towards the fortress with a white flag. Due to some unwritten rules, Austrian soldiers generally would not fire at such an officer, so Baogeny could walk to the bottom of the fortress unharmed. He shouted loudly, "I'm Lieutenant General Baogeny Lajus of the Austrian Empire. I order you to open the city gate and let me in." The officers in the fortress all knew General Baogeny. In fact, Baogeny used to be the highest officer here, so everyone looked at each other in shock. And strictly speaking, Baogeny Lajos, the highest military governor of the St. Stephen's Crown region, did have the authority to order them to do so. However, there seems to have been a war between Austria and Hungary at this time, otherwise there is no way to explain the large-scale offensive behavior of the Hungarian hussars just now. Some people proposed to kill the enemy general directly, but they were immediately opposed by others, because such a noble would usually be forgiven, even if he took the lead in rebellion, as long as he admitted his crime. And these defenders are all civilians. If this nobleman dies, he may be retaliated against one day. At this time, one of Baogeny's former subordinates came forward to ask Baogeny to guarantee that the Hungarians would let them go. Baogeny agreed, and the massacre of Pressburg was repeated. But unlike in history, there was only a fortress of 1,500 people on the periphery. The real Pressburg was still in Austria's hands. But the Hungarians still declared victory. Chapter 899. This is not Sparta. City of Venice. Franz calculated that the 180,000 troops that could be mobilized at this time already accounted for 1/3 of the total strength of the Austrian Imperial Army. After completing the internal cleaning, he finally got rid of the shackles of the great nobles in the country for the first time. Although Albrecht and Friedrich are also great nobles, at least they don't have the idea of being moths yet. At least 1/3 of the so-called Italian coalition has fled. After all, after losing the banner of the Pope, the appeal of nationalism does not seem to be that strong. This is still under the premise that Labor adopts tough control methods. If it were not for the deterrence of severe punishments, the Italian coalition at this time may no longer exist. But even so, with a lack of weapons and supplies, their morale was extremely low. Now Lapor occupies a dangerous Hukau terrain, so it can barely hold on. In fact, Albrecht had already found a way to break through, but Franz felt that no matter how exciting the performance was without an audience, it lacked a little bit of feeling. The audience Franz was referring to was, of course, Pius IX. Although he himself did not understand military matters, his advisors told him so. At this time, the terrain occupied by Labor was like Thermopylae. The Spartans used only 300 warriors to withstand the attack of the Persian army of 1 million. This greatly shocked Pius IX. You must know that the traitor Lapor was the party with more people at this time. In fact, behind the so-called 300 warriors were more than 5,000 servants and coalition forces from other countries, and the Persians were far from millions. Dear Archduke Franz, how many men do you plan to use to attack the Bereni Valley? Pius IX pretended to be calm, but his twitching lips and trembling hands could not deceive others. The Pope's acting ability is really poor, but Franz still has to try his best to cooperate and pretend not to notice. His Majesty the Pope, there are still remnants of bandits operating in the Venetian region at this time. We still need some troops to maintain order, dear Archduke Franz. I hope you know that there are still hundreds of thousands of enemies, and they occupy a favorable terrain. And those treacherous people in Rome are persecuting innocent people. I hope you can take back the holy city as soon as possible. Can you tell me the total force you can mobilize now? It was a bit difficult for Pius IX to describe and call Franz a child under the age of 18 with respectful undue, but he still did so, which shows that he was really at the end of his rope. 50. thousand, Franz answered simply. Is it too little? This was completely different from what Pius IX had in mind, but he still thought of the raid on Rome from the sea that Stefan Capella mentioned before. Is Austria going to attack Rome from the sea? What about the traitor Apple? No, Your Majesty the Pope. The Austrian Imperial Navy will not participate in this operation. We will directly defeat Lapor's rebels from the front and liberate the Holy City. Pius IX and his advisors stared closely at Franz, hoping that this was just a bad joke point, but Franz looked very serious, and they all began to doubt the correctness of coming to Venice to seek help from Austria. But in fact, except for Austria, Pius IX had no place to send reinforcement at this time. There were only a few Catholic powers on the European continent. Spain had no time to take care of itself, and the French provisional government came to power. When they started a revolution, they even beheaded their own king, let alone the foreign pope. After excluding France and Spain, Austria became the only option. In fact, there was originally Naples, but at this time Fernando II also sent troops to participate in the Holy War, and he also formed a liberal government. Pius IX was afraid that the same thing would happen to Naples as in the Papal States, so he did not go to Naples first as historically. Now, Austria has sent such a young archduke. Although the world thinks highly of him, in the opinion of Pius IX, this child is probably a fool. He can only lament his bad luck. In the reverse battle of Thermopylae with 50,000 people versus 150,000 people, Pius IX really didn't know how Austria was going to win this war. However, when he arrived at the battlefield, he realized that what he saw was beyond his imagination. Lapor's army defended the huge terrain. No matter how many people there were on the attacking side, the number of troops fighting the other side at the same time could not exceed 2,000. On the other side of the pot mouth is a fan, where the defender can deploy several times the offensive force and firepower. No matter how you look at it, Austria, as the attacking party, will be crushed by an absolute disadvantage. Even if it wins the final victory, the casualties must be astronomical. Laboa thinks the same. He just hopes that more people can be buried with him. For some reason Labor thought of a country called Kin in the Far East, and the first king of that country created an underground army for himself. Maybe he thinks so too. Labor said to himself he couldn't help but feel a little sympathy for the emperor who was thousands of miles away and thousands of years apart. Damn Austria, damn the Pope, damn Italy, go to hell. Labor cursed and drove the soldiers toward their positions with the crack of his whip. The geology in the mountainous areas of central Italy is very hard and not suitable for digging, but Lapor couldn't care less. He just wanted to dig a trench, and no one could stop him. But the soldier in front of him suddenly stopped and didn't react, even if the whip hit him. He just looked straight towards the sky. Damn it, sluggard. Lapor cursed and looked up. He was so surprised that he couldn't close his mouth. A huge oval-shaped monster was floating in the sky. It had no wings or feathers, but it could fly in the air, and fire would shoot out from behind its butt. Oh my god. Oh god. What a monster that is. At this moment, all the soldiers of the original Italian coalition exclaimed that this was the first time they had seen such a huge aircraft. When there was no concept of aircraft before, one can imagine the shock when seeing an airship for the first time. Some people were so scared that they urinated, some tried to bury their heads in the soil so that they might not be discovered by the monsters in the sky, and some knelt down to pray. They always like to connect unknown things with gods. Lapor was so frightened that he collapsed to the ground and kept making the famous cross on his chest, as if someone would come to protect him. But this novel thing can also arouse a curiosity of some people, and they find that there is someone in the monster's belly. Look. There's someone. There's someone. That's a person. As the first airship soldiers of the Austrian Empire, they were very proud. Especially when they saw the crowd of people looking up below. They really felt like they had become gods. It's just that they were playing the god of destruction, and a barrel was pushed off the airship. Then a loud bang resounded in the valley, and sawdust, smoke, and minced meat flew everywhere. This is not Sparta. Chapter 900 Complete Victory. The Pope said something that he himself did not understand what it meant, but he was certain that the war was won, and that Archduke Franz was indeed as extraordinary and transcendent as rumored. No, this was completely beyond his imagination. One by one, the airships rose into the sky, drifted over the ridges, and then dropped barrels of horrific bombs on the rebels. These barrels were mixed with nitroglycerine, which was 30 times more powerful than commonly used black powder. The instability of nitroglycerine turned out to be an advantage at this point, as it did not require a fuse. The impact of falling from a high altitude is enough to detonate such horrific explosives, but the reality is that some of them detonate under the continuous effect of gravity acceleration before they even hit the ground point, although it failed to explode on the ground as expected after tests by the Austrian military. The nitroglycerine bomb was more powerful when detonated in the air, and the killing radius could be expanded by at least 1.5 times. Austrian airships continued to throw explosives over the heads of Labor's army. Faced with this unprecedented air attack, the rebels were temporarily at a loss. Some people raised their guns and lowered them. They doubted whether their guns were useful in the face of such a big monster. The air wave when the bomb hit the ground directly lifted everyone around it, and at the same time, there were gravel and sawdust flying everywhere. The originally inconspicuous gravel became a deadly weapon, breaking bones and tendons on nearby soldiers. Some unlucky stones directly hit the eyeballs, or penetrated the skull and directly erupted into a cloud of blood mist. Help. Monster. My hand is gone. I can't see. I can't see anything. Wails, screams, and explosions occurred one after another. The gods were also very busy on this day, because there were so many people praying. However, the gods are always more reserved, and they will not let miracles happen, just because of the begging of these people. As the head coach, Labor had never seen such a huge monster, and his performance was no better than that of ordinary soldiers from farmers and citizens. Labor frantically tried to get under the horse's belly, but the chaos and explosion also frightened the horse. Moreover, the new thing of airship is really too scary. Just the shadow it casts from high school evokes the instinctive fear of human beings. Lapor shouted to his cronies, but no one wanted to care about him at this time. Everyone was busy running for their lives in desperation. Laport fled to another carriage, but as a loud noise was heard in his ears, he and the carriage were thrown away. Accompanied by strong tinnitus and dizziness, Labor saw that finally some soldiers began to fight back with their guns, but before he could laugh, the soldiers turned to stone. Rapol felt very angry that his Caesar's men were not noble and brave Roman soldiers, but a group of cowardly slaves. Laport managed to get up, but he soon became petrified on the spot, because on the other side of the mountain, there was a steady stream of airships drifting over the hills and attacking the coalition forces at the same time. The ground troops of the Austrian Empire also began to take action. The soldiers walked into the valley to the beat of neat drums without encountering any resistance at all. In addition to the deterrent power of the monsters in the sky, the skirmishers of the Austrian Empire on the ground also contributed. Because they had fully installed new lever-type rifled rifles, their firepower and accuracy far exceeded those of the Italian Confederates at Tanagachi, where only 1,000 mancu could be deployed. Only more than 200 skirmishers entered dispersedly, which greatly reduced the area affected by the attack. Moreover, skirmishers can also cause maximum damage to the enemy in the shortest time, which is conducive to the entry of follow-up troops. The skirmishers are actually just bait to attract the enemy, and then the rocket troops concentrate their firepower to cover the enemy, and finally the battlefield is the decisive battle for the infantry brigade. The reason why we rely on rocket troops is that on the one hand, rockets have a fast rate of fire and can inflict tons of damage in a short period of time. On the other hand, it is no problem for soldiers in the Italian mountainous areas to carry rockets on their backs, but it is too difficult to push them with heavy artillery. According to estimates from Albrecht's frontline command, the battle will last 3 to 4 hours, and the Italian Confederate forces will collapse. But the actual situation is that the Italian Federal forces collapsed the moment they saw the airship, and the skirmishers encountered no resistance at all. When they entered. The infantry brigade behind was basically here to hunt rabbits, and the mountains and plains were full of deserters from the coalition forces. Franz's order was not to kill indiscriminately, He didn't care about devils and angels. Franz only knew that these people were valuable laborers and could accept lower living standards regardless of whether they are devils or angels. Throwing them into a factory for a few months will guarantee that they will become social animals. To be honest, it was actually the first time for most people in the Austrian army to see an airship. The shock was beyond words, and the powerful power made people feel like a divine punishment. However, the soldiers of the Austrian army were also very fortunate that such terrifying war weapons belonged to their side. The Italian federal forces only made sporadic resistance. Marshal Lappol, who was called a believer of the devil by Pius IX, was found hiding in a crevice in the mountains. Lappol didn't want to surrender, let alone come out. In the end, 2 Austrian soldiers tied him with a lasso and forced him out. The other coalition officers had already dispersed, but their soldiers did not want to let them go. The surrendered coalition soldiers pointed out the escape direction of the officers almost without thinking, and even said whether the other party had weapons, how many subordinates they had, and their character with the help of this group of qualified prisoners. The post-war handling work of the Austrian army will be much easier. It was rare for a prisoner to help capture a prisoner. This battle greatly touched Pius IX, especially those monsters that could fly in the sky, which completely broke his previous understanding. The Pope began to believe the words of the chief exorcist. Perhaps this Archduke Franz was really different. Pius IX had already begun to consider the outrageous deal proposed by Franz. The statistics of the war soon came out. The Austrian side only suffered 37 casualties, but lost 1 airship. In fact, problems will inevitably arise when this new type of war weapon is put into complex terrain for the first time. This time, due to unknown reasons, the airship lost control and eventually hit a mountain wall. However, the tactical effect is surprisingly good. The explosion of the airship is far more powerful than the bomb. The huge explosion almost caused a mountain landslide, and the rubble directly killed nearly 100 coalition soldiers. The losses of the Italian coalition forces were smaller than expected. Only more than 3,000 people were killed, half of whom were trampled to death by their own people during their escape. An army that once boasted millions of soldiers only captured less than 80,000 prisoners. These people will be sent to the Austrian mainland or overseas colonies after a simple identification, or they will have to pay their debts and redeem themselves according to the old rules. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.